Welcome, dear listener, to another quiet wander through the pages of history. Tonight, we're diving headfirst into a chapter of ancient life that still echoes like a mischievous poltergeist through time. Whether you're snuggled up with a warm drink or already wrapped in blankets, thank you for letting my voice be the slightly unhinged companion to your evening or morning or afternoon. Wherever and whenever you are, let me know. Speaking of time and place, as I record this, it's a rather pleasant evening here in Romania, the kind where the last rays of sun are just dipping below the Carpathians, and I'm quite certain I heard a distant owl hoot, which is either charmingly atmospheric or a sign I need more sleep. Are you hearing this as the sun salutes the day, or are you, like me, surrounded by the hush of nighttime, perhaps with a rogue sock monster under the bed? A world of woes and witches, a most unfortunate time to be alive. Picture this, if you will, a world where shadows held secrets tighter than a miser's purse, and every stubbed toe, every mysteriously spoiled batch of haggis, every single bad hair day demanded a scapegoat. Not just any scapegoat, mind you, but one you could point at, ideally with a torch, where the howling of winter winds through the glens carried whispers of dark magic, and, heaven forbid, a woman's knowledge of herbs, the very knowledge that might, save lives, could get her a one-way ticket to a very unpleasant bonfire. This, my friends, was medieval Scotland during the glorious, terrifying height of the witch trials. Imagine a land gripped by so much fear and suspicion, you'd think they invented the concept of neighbour turned against neighbour, reality TV, but with far higher stakes and considerably less prize money. The very foundations of Scottish society didn't just wobble, they trembled, shuddered, and threatened to collapse under the sheer, suffocating weight of this supernatural paranoia. It wasn't an earthquake, no, but a collective societal tremor caused by rampant, unchecked fear. The Catholic Church already wielding more power over the daily lives of every Scot, from the humblest peasant to the mightiest clan chief, who probably still got stern looks for missing Sunday service, found witchcraft accusations to be the ultimate mic drop. It was a new, potent weapon of control in their already impressive arsenal. Oh, you question our authority. Perhaps you're in league with the unholy host. Feudal lords, ever eager to consolidate their authority and perhaps snatch a few extra sheep, or a particularly fertile patch of land from a troublesome rival, discovered that cries of sorcery could eliminate problematic vassals faster than you could say hocus pocus. And then there were the common folk, poor souls, battling famine that gnawed at their stomachs, diseases that swept through villages like a particularly virulent social media trend, and the endless, exhausting cycle of clan warfare. They weren't exactly living their best lives. Naturally, they just needed someone to blame for their miserable lot, someone other than, say, poor sanitation or bad agricultural practices. So, in the smoky darkness of thatched cottages and the cold, echoey halls of grand castles, the fear of witches wasn't just a concept. It became a living, breathing, festering entity that poisoned hearts and minds, turning suspicion into conviction with alarming speed. The unlikely suspects and their unfortunate feline friends, when being helpful, was deadly. No one was safe from suspicion, and I mean no one. Not the midwife whose patients suspiciously lived while others, well, didn't. She must be using unnatural methods, right? Not the wise woman who knew exactly which herbs could heal a fever, and which could, shall we say, encourage a rapid exit from this mortal coil. Clearly a sign of forbidden knowledge, and certainly not the old widow living alone with only her cats for company. Because, let's be real, in medieval Scotland, who trusts a woman with that many cats? They're practically a coven in training, just waiting for the moon to be full so they can plot mischief with their human. Any of these perfectly normal, often incredibly helpful individuals could find themselves suddenly, inexplicably dragged before the terrifying Kirk session, the local church court, where gossip was considered evidence, or the equally intimidating sheriff's court. And to what end? To face charges that, more often than not, carried but one terrifying penalty: death by fire. Talk about a harsh performance review. It was less a critique and more an inferno. The tools of justice. Spoiler, they weren't just unpretty, they were inventive horrors. The witch hunters themselves. Oh, these charming individuals. They moved through the Scottish countryside like harbingers of doom, wearing expressions that suggested they just smelled something truly awful, possibly a particularly old and pungent cheese, or perhaps just their own self-importance. Armed with grim knowledge of torture, which they probably studied with a disturbing zeal, and an unshakable belief in their righteous, utterly deranged cause, they carried with them instruments of agony designed to extract confessions from even the most innocent victims. We're talking about devices that sound like they belong in a horror movie marathon, not a courtroom. There were thumb screws which, as the name suggests, were designed to turn your digits into a fine powder. Imagine trying to knit after that. Then came the iron boots, cunning contraptions that slowly compressed the feet until the victims screamed for mercy, or perhaps just for a comfy pair of slippers and a foot bath. And let's not forget the delightful pillywinks, which twisted limbs until joints popped from their sockets with a sickening snap that would make a chiropractor faint. These, dear listeners, were the tools of justice in an age that hilariously confused cruelty with godliness. It's almost comical, if it weren't so utterly barbaric. We are doing God's work by crushing your bones, what a tagline. But the true gut-wrenching horror of the Scottish witch hunts wasn't just the agonizing instruments of pain, or even the horrifying fiery send-offs. No, it lay in the systematic destruction of reason itself. It was the deliberate, chilling abandonment of anything resembling mercy or compassion in favor of a full-blown, raging fear and hatred fiesta. It was a time when the very qualities that make us, well, us, our capacity for doubt, for questioning, for demanding actual verifiable evidence, not just, she looked at me funny, or my cow stopped milking after she walked by, were chucked out the window faster than a rogue haggis escaping a pot, all in favour of blind faith in accusations that defied every single shred of logic, common sense, and basic human decency. It was a collective sanity break, when being a woman was a liability and wearing too many scarves could be suspicious. The accused witches of Scotland were, to an overwhelmingly disproportionate degree, women. Often, they were the ones who dared to step even an inch outside the narrow, suffocating confines of acceptable feminine behaviour. You know, the unmarried woman living independently. Scandalous. Who needs a man anyway? Apparently the Church and the Lords did. The widow who refused to remarry and become someone's glorified maid and baby maker. Clearly, she was up to something nefarious. The healer, whose knowledge of ancient remedies threatened the exclusive monopoly of those male physicians who mostly prescribed leeches and prayer, often in that order. Or, horror of horrors, the outspoken woman who dared to challenge the word of her betters, those men who, with all due respect, probably thought the sun revolved around them. In a society that demanded female submission and silence louder than a banshee's wail, any woman who displayed independence of thought or action, any flicker of autonomy, risked being branded a servant of Satan. Basically, if you weren't barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen, churning butter and producing heirs, you were probably consorting with Beelzebub, or at least his slightly less evil cousin. Now, let's be clear. This wasn't just misogyny, though that certainly played a starring villainous role, probably with a sinister twirled moustache. The witch hunts were a terrifying manifestation of deeper systemic fears plaguing medieval Scottish society. The pervasive fear of the unknown, of forces beyond human control, of change itself, which, let's face it, is terrifying to humans even today. When crop failures meant literal starvation, when disease could wipe out entire families in a horrifying blink, when the very survival of the clan hung by a thread thinner than a whisper, the promise that evil could be identified and eliminated offered a seductive, intoxicating illusion of control over an uncontrollable, often brutal world. It was easier to say, we can't fix the plague, but hey, we can definitely burn Mrs. McGillicuddy for having a cat that looks suspiciously intelligent. Scotland's spooky geography, a landscape primed for paranoia. Even Scotland's geography seemed to be in on the whole dark imaginings vibe. It's a land sculpted by ancient forces, and its very landscape seemed to whisper tales of the uncanny. the mist-shrouded highlands, with their ancient standing stones that stood sentinel over forgotten secrets, and their mysterious cairns which, let's be honest, totally look like alien landing pads just waiting for a cosmic Uber. The deep lochs, dark and still that reflected no light, even on the brightest days, perfect for hiding Nessie, or, a witch's cauldron bubbling with unspeakable concoctions, and the endless ancient forests where wolves still howled in the darkness, and stranger things were said to dwell, things that slithered, things that watched, things that were probably just tired squirrels but in a terrified mind. Anything seemed possible. This was a landscape that practically begged for tales of old gods and older magics, a land where the boundary between the natural and supernatural seemed thinner than a supermodel's patience on a bad day. It was a perfect stage for a theatrical display of fear. Into this atmosphere of fear, superstition, and slightly dodgy weather came the witch hunters. These weren't just random villagers. These were men who claimed divine authority, a direct hotline to the Almighty, to root out evil wherever it might hide. Some, bless their misguided hearts, were sincere believers, truly convinced they served God by playing a real-life game of Whack-A-Witch, smashing what they perceived as agents of Satan. Others, however, were shrewd opportunists who saw in the witch hunts a clear, lucrative path to wealth and power, because, surprise, surprise, the property of convicted witches was surprisingly, conveniently forfeit to the crown, or even better, to their accusers. So, a new house and some livestock for merely pointing a finger. Sounds like a medieval pyramid scheme. And then, of course, there were the sadists who found in the legally sanctioned torture of helpless victims an outlet for their darkest, most twisted impulses. It was like a medieval job fair, but with more thumbscrews and considerably less health and safety regulations. The tests of witchcraft, a masterclass in illogical cruelty. The methods these witch hunters employed would chill the blood of modern observers, mostly because they're so spectacularly, bafflingly illogical. Take the infamous Devil's Mark search, a systematic, invasive, and deeply humiliating examination of the accused's naked body with pins and needles. The idea was that the devil would leave a special mark, a mole, a birthmark, even a scar, that would be insensitive to pain or wouldn't bleed. So, if you were stoic, had particularly tough skin, or simply lucky enough to have a spot that momentarily went numb, you were basically toast. Oh, you didn't flinch? Must be a witch. Then there was the water test, often called swimming the witch. The accused was bound, often right thumb to left big toe, and thrown into deep, usually freezing water. The twisted, nonsensical logic behind this was that pure water, being an element created by God, would reject the corrupt, sinful flesh of a witch, causing her to float. An innocent person, being, normal human flesh and bone, would sink and, in all likelihood, drown. So, survival literally became proof of guilt. It was the ultimate lose-lose situation, a truly diabolical catch-22. Congratulations, you didn't drown. Now, about that fire. Because we're nothing if not thorough. Justice, but make it backwards, and highly ineffective. Perhaps the most insidious aspect of these trials was how they completely, utterly corrupted the concept of justice. It wasn't just bent, it was broken, melted down, and reformed into something monstrous. Accusations were accepted without a shred of evidence, often based on rumour, malice, or a bad dream someone had. Confessions extracted through torture were treated as gospel truth, as if someone screaming, "I'm a witch and I rode a badger to the moon." After days of sleep deprivation and agonizing pain was totally reliable testimony, and the normal protections afforded to the accused in any semblance of a fair legal system were stripped away faster than a cheap suit in a hurricane. The burden of proof was reversed, requiring the accused to prove their innocence rather than the accusers to prove guilt. In such circumstances, innocence was about as easy to establish as finding a unicorn on a unicycle performing Shakespeare in Romanian. It was nearly impossible. The psychological warfare employed against the accused was as brutal, if not more so, than any physical torture. Prisoners were kept in darkness and isolation, denied adequate food and water, subjected to constant interrogation and threats. They were told that confession would bring mercy, a sweet, enticing lie, though in practice it rarely did. They were confronted with the testimony of friends and neighbours who had been coerced or bribed into bearing false witness. Imagine your best friend testifying against you because someone gave them a cow. The very foundations of trust and community, the essential glue of any society, were systematically destroyed in the service of extracting these admissions of guilt. The perils of sleep deprivation and the allure of pointy hats. Sleep deprivation was another favoured technique of the witch hunters. It's a classic for a reason. It works. The accused would be kept awake for days on end, questioned continuously, relentlessly, until sheer exhaustion and utter desperation broke down their resistance. In their weakened, disoriented state, many would confess to anything their tormentors suggested, no matter how outlandish. They'd admit to flying through the air on broomsticks, without proper flight training, I might add, which is frankly irresponsible, consorting with demons, who were probably just lonely and misunderstood, or casting spells to blight their neighbours' crops, specifically the prize-winning turnips, because why not? These confessions, extracted through methods that we would now recognise as profound psychological torture, were then conveniently used as evidence against other accused witches, creating an ever-widening, terrifying web of accusations and fear, like a particularly nasty game of supernatural telephone where everyone ends up burned. Follow the money. It always leads to trouble, especially when witches are involved. The economic dimension of the witch hunts is also worth a chuckle, albeit a very dark, bitter one. The costs of imprisonment, trial, and execution were typically charged to the accused or, if they were already destitute, to their terrified families. This created a perverse, macabre incentive for authorities to pursue cases, even when the evidence was as flimsy as a spiderweb in a gale. Professional witch hunters, yes, that was a job title, presumably with a business card, were often paid by results, receiving bounties for each conviction they secured. Imagine being paid per burned body, and the property of convicted witches, you guessed it, forfeit. Confiscated by the crown or in many cases by their accusers. So, the innocent became a source of profit for their persecutors. It was the original pay-to-play system, but with considerably more immolation and considerably less actual playing. Social shenanigans and childhood nightmares, the fabric of society unravels. The social dynamics of accusation were equally corrupt and unsettling. Old grudges between neighbours, that time Mrs. Henderson's chicken wandered into your yard, could be settled through a quick, devastating charge of witchcraft. Property disputes, easily resolved by eliminating one's opponent through accusations of sorcery. Unpopular individuals, whether because of their religion, their peculiar behaviour, their unusual fashion sense, or simply their unfortunate facial features, found themselves incredibly vulnerable to charges that were, by design, impossible to refute. The witch trials became a chilling weapon that could be wielded by anyone with sufficient cunning, ruthlessness, and a lack of moral compass. And talk about a bummer for the kids. Children were certainly not spared from this reign of terror. In fact, they were actively pulled into it. Young people were encouraged to inform on their parents, siblings, and even their playmates. The testimony of children was given special weight, bizarrely, as it was believed that their innocence made them particularly sensitive to the presence of evil, and, apparently, particularly susceptible to manipulation. This led to tragic, heartbreaking cases where families were literally torn apart by accusations from their own offspring, often children who had been coached or coerced by adults with profoundly ulterior motives. Imagine a child, wide-eyed and terrified, pointing a trembling finger at their own mother and whispering, "Mommy, Daddy said you talked to the devil. Can I have his dessert now, and maybe his new toy?" The clergy's role, not their finest hour, nor their nicest. The clergy played a particularly sinister, pervasive role in promoting and perpetuating the witch hunts. From the pulpit, they thundered sermons proclaiming that witches were real, that they posed an existential, immediate threat to Christian society, which, let's be honest, seemed pretty threatened already by things like poverty and illiteracy. They provided theological justification for torture and execution, arguing with twisted logic that the souls of witches were already damned, and that their earthly suffering was merely a fun little preview of eternal, fiery punishment. This religious sanction gave the witch hunters an aura of divine authority that made resistance seem not just futile, but positively sinful. Resist, but God wants me to burn you. It's for your own good, spiritually speaking. Justice denied, a system designed for conviction, not fairness. The legal system itself, which, in a sane world, should have protected the innocent, was systematically corrupted to serve the predetermined ends of the witch hunters. Special courts were established with relaxed rules of evidence and procedure, making them less like courts of law and more like legal free-for-alls. Judges were not selected for their commitment to justice or their impartiality, but for their enthusiasm for the prosecution of witches. Torture was not only permitted but actively encouraged as a means of extracting truth, and the normal right to legal representation often completely denied, leaving the accused to face their persecutors alone, terrified and utterly defenseless. It was basically a legal system designed by a very bored supervillain with a flair for the dramatic and a penchant for cruelty. This horrific perversion of justice created a climate of terror that extended far beyond those who were actually accused. Every single woman in Scotland lived with the chilling knowledge that a careless word, an unlucky coincidence, like sneezing during a sermon, or having a cat that looked at someone askance, or the sheer malice of a jealous neighbour could bring the witch hunters and their instruments of agony right to her door. This all-encompassing fear had a profound, suffocating impact on Scottish society, silencing dissent, discouraging independence of thought, and creating a culture of suspicion and conformity that would persist long after the last witch had gone up in smoke. The fiery farewell and its lingering unpleasant scent. The methods of execution employed against convicted witches were designed not merely to kill, but to terrorize. Burning at the stake was the preferred method, based on the rather illogical belief that fire would not only end the witch's life, but also purify her corrupted flesh and prevent her from returning from the dead, because apparently a simple burial wasn't enough to contain a supernatural menace. The condemned were often strangled before the flames reached them, a small, fleeting mercy that was sometimes cruelly denied to those whose crimes were deemed particularly heinous, ensuring a slow, agonizing death. The public nature of these executions, attended by large crowds who were actively encouraged to view them as a form of entertainment and moral lesson, served to reinforce the terrifying message: this is the fate that awaits anyone who dares to challenge the established order, or who just looks a bit odd. Now, who wants popcorn and a good viewing spot? The psychological impact of witnessing such executions cannot be underestimated. Children were brought to watch the burnings, ostensibly as a form of moral education, learning that this was the terrifying price of sin and rebellion against God and society. The smell of burning flesh, the screams of the dying, the horrifying sight of human beings reduced to ash and bone. These images burned themselves irrevocably into the collective memory of Scottish society, creating trauma that would echo and reverberate through generations. Even those who escaped immediate execution did not escape unscathed. Many of the accused died in prison, succumbing to the brutal conditions of their confinement, the lingering effects of torture, or simply profound despair. Others, released after months or even years of imprisonment, found themselves utterly shunned by their communities, their reputations destroyed beyond repair, their families scattered and broken. The stigma of having been accused of witchcraft was a stain that no amount of industrial strength bleach, or indeed time, could ever fully wash away. It was a permanent brand of shame. Cultural casualty and superstitious silliness, the erosion of identity. The witch hunts also had a devastating, long-lasting impact on traditional Scottish culture, particularly the rich folk knowledge and practices that had been passed down through generations. Herbalism, midwifery, and other invaluable forms of traditional healing were violently suppressed as potentially demonic, causing immeasurable harm to communities that relied on them. Ancient customs and festivals, deeply rooted in the land and its history, were banned as pagan survivals, deemed dangerous by a zealous clergy. The vibrant, rich oral tradition of Scottish folklore was impoverished as storytellers, fearing accusation, self-censored their tales, afraid that their narratives might be interpreted as evidence of supernatural beliefs. No more tales of wee beasties or fairy folk for you, dear children. The pervasive role of superstition in fueling the witch hunts cannot be overlooked. Medieval Scots lived in a world where the supernatural was considered as real and immediate as the dirt beneath their feet or the rain on their faces. Belief in fairies, ghosts, demons, and all manner of otherworldly creatures was universal, deeply ingrained in their worldview. This created a mental framework in which accusations of witchcraft seemed not only plausible but entirely logical. When crops failed inexplicably, when cattle sickened and died without clear cause, when children died tragically young and often, supernatural causes were almost always the first, most comforting and most terrifying explanation that came to mind. In such an environment, the leap from unexplained misfortune to accusations of malevolent magic was disturbingly small, a mere step across a very thin line. It was like blaming your persistent car trouble on a mischievous gnome living under the hood, rather than, say, a dead battery or a mechanic who charges too much. The witch hunters, ever the opportunists, exploited these deeply held beliefs ruthlessly. They presented themselves as the ultimate experts in detecting and combating supernatural evil, the only ones who truly understood the dark forces at play. They developed elaborate, utterly absurd theories about how witches operated, how they could be identified, usually by poking them with pins, and how they could be defeated. These theories, however nonsensical they might seem to modern ears, were presented with all the grave authority of learned scholarship and rigid religious doctrine. The average Scottish peasant, struggling simply to survive in a harsh and uncertain world, had little choice but to accept the word of those who claimed superior knowledge and divine sanction. Yes, fine, you're the expert on flying grannies and demonic pacts. Just please don't burn my granny. A European problem, politically motivated and socially devastating. It's also crucial to understand the international dimension of the Scottish witch hunts. Scotland was not unique in its profound witchy woes. This terrifying phenomenon swept across much of Europe during the late medieval and early modern periods, like a particularly nasty contagion. Scottish witch hunters didn't invent their methods in isolation. They actively drew inspiration and techniques from their counterparts in other countries, adapting foreign methods to local conditions with unsettling efficiency. This international exchange of ideas and brutal practices helped to standardize and intensify the persecution, creating a pan-European culture of witch hunting that ultimately claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. It was like a medieval murderous flash mob that lasted for centuries. The political manipulation of witchcraft accusations was another dark, cynical feature of the Scottish trials. Rival factions within the nobility, constantly vying for power and influence, ruthlessly used charges of sorcery to eliminate their opponents, a far more effective method than, say, a strongly worded letter. Meanwhile, monarchs, ever eager to suppress dissent and consolidate their own power, eagerly employed witch hunters as an instrument of political repression. The accusation of witchcraft thus became a powerful political weapon that could be deployed against anyone who posed even the slightest threat to the established order. In this context, the witch trials served not just as a means of social control, but as an instrument of targeted political assassination, albeit with more fire and less poison. Gender, illness, and stagnation, the unseen costs. The deeply ingrained gender dynamics of the witch hunts reveal much about the profoundly patriarchal nature of medieval Scottish society. The overwhelming majority of those accused were, as mentioned, women, and the charges often centred on supposed violations of contemporary gender norms. Women who were too independent, too knowledgeable, too outspoken, or simply too old and therefore deemed useless to male-dominated society, found themselves particularly vulnerable. The witch trials in essence served as a brutal, terrifying means of enforcing female subordination and systematically eliminating women who dared to challenge male authority, even implicitly. A woman with an opinion must be the devil's work, clearly, because no human woman would dare. The profound medical ignorance of the period also contributed significantly to the persistence of witch beliefs. In an age when the true causes of disease were poorly understood, beyond perhaps bad air or divine wrath, when mental illness was tragically and universally attributed to demonic possession, and when infant mortality was shockingly, tragically common, supernatural explanations for suffering seemed not only reasonable, but almost comforting in their simplicity. Midwives and healers, who dealt most directly with matters of life and death, birth and decay, were particularly suspect because their work brought them into direct contact with forces that seem mysterious and powerful to their less informed contemporaries. She saved that baby, but how? It must be black magic, because my medicine of leeches and prayer didn't work. The lasting scars, an unforgettable legacy, the impact of the witch hunts on Scottish intellectual life was profound and lasting. The pervasive climate of fear and suspicion that they created actively discouraged scientific inquiry, rational thought, and any form of intellectual curiosity that strayed from the narrow path of accepted dogma. Scholars and thinkers learned, quickly and painfully, to avoid topics that might be construed as dangerous, heretical, or even just a bit too clever. The pursuit of knowledge itself became suspect if it strayed too far from accepted religious doctrine. This intellectual stagnation, this chilling of curiosity, helped ensure that Scotland remained trapped in cycles of superstition and ignorance for generations, long after the fires had cooled. Imagine trying to innovate or discover something new when any breakthrough could get you branded as a Satanist. Behold, I have invented the wheel. Wait, is that a pitchfork? The economic costs of the witch hunts, though difficult to calculate precisely, were enormous. The vast resources devoted to hunting, imprisoning, trying, and executing alleged witches could have been used for so many more productive purposes, like building better roads, improving agriculture, or, dare I say, inventing central heating. The tragic loss of skilled individuals, particularly women with invaluable knowledge of healing and midwifery, impoverished communities, and inevitably increased mortality rates. The overall climate of fear discouraged innovation and enterprise, as any unusual success, whether in farming or trade, might ironically be attributed to supernatural assistance, and therefore become immediate grounds for accusation. Wow, your crops are amazing this year, you must be a witch! Followed by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. And finally, the psychological trauma inflicted by the witch hunts extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. Entire communities were poisoned by suspicion and fear, a pervasive dread that seeped into every interaction. Trust between neighbours, the very bedrock of a functional society, was systematically destroyed as people learned, through horrifying example, that anyone might be a potential accuser, or, worse, a potential victim. The very bonds that held Scottish society together were systematically weakened as the witch hunters sowed discord, paranoia, and an inescapable sense of dread. The effects of this social fragmentation, this deep national wound, would persist long after the trials themselves had faded into historical memory, leaving a chilling, indelible legacy that echoes even today in the quiet glens and mist-shrouded peaks. Quite the charming bedtime story, right? Perhaps we should discuss something cheerier next time, like the history of ice cream. What aspect of this dark chapter of history do you find most unsettling, or, dare I say, ironically amusing in its sheer terrifying absurdity? Hey there, night owls, history buffs, and anyone currently regretting their life choices. Welcome to tonight's ultimate director's cut, supersized deep dive into the wonderfully weird world of medieval beauty standards. I'm so glad you're here, because tonight we're slipping into the flickering candlelight of medieval times where being too pretty wasn't just a compliment. It was basically an express ticket to trouble. Picture this. You're in a drafty stone castle, your reflection glinting in a polished bronze mirror. Your cheeks glow, your hair catches the firelight, and whispers follow you like shadows. But here's the kicker. that radiant face might just get you accused of witchcraft, or worse, make you a pawn in a noble's deadly game. In this world, beauty is a double-edged sword, and spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this unscathed. Before we dive headfirst into the historical absurdity, do me a solid. If you genuinely enjoy what I do here, hit that like button and maybe even subscribe. It's the digital equivalent of tossing me a perfectly ripe, non-poisonous apple, which, let's be honest, was a rare and valuable commodity back then. And since I love picturing where you're all drifting off from, drop a comment with your city and local time. Are you in a bustling metropolis or a sleepy hamlet? Perhaps Bucharest, where it's currently 10:46 p.m. on a Friday? Perfect for some historical shenanigans. Either way, you're my kind of peculiar. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft medieval draft hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Try not to think about the hygiene too much. You're standing in a bustling medieval village, the air thick with wood smoke and the tangy, vaguely unsettling scent of fresh bread mixed with, well, let's just say, a general musk of unwashed humanity and livestock. The cobblestones beneath your worn leather shoes are uneven, slick with a fine layer of mud and refuse. Navigating this charming landscape is a challenge in itself, but it's compounded by the incessant stares. People stare as you pass, their eyes lingering a bit too long, darting away only to snap back the moment they think you're not looking. Beauty in these times wasn't just rare, it was a signal, a spark that could ignite a full-blown societal inferno. Let's be real, you're not just pretty, you're dangerously pretty. The kind of striking that makes old women clutch their rosaries like they're fending off a succubus, makes babies momentarily stop wailing, a rare blessing to be fair, and causes young men to trip over their own feet, attempting to look casual, while simultaneously staring directly at your face with an almost painful intensity. But why, you ask, was this a problem? Why couldn't a perfectly pleasant visage just exist in peace? Well, medieval society wasn't exactly known for its chill vibes, least of all when it came to appearances. They believed looks were a message, a divine billboard from the heavens, or, more ominously, from somewhere far, far darker. A face too fair, too symmetrical, too radiant, could mean God handcrafted you with extra care, like a walking, breathing masterpiece. But that same face could just as easily scream, "Deal with the devil," a particularly unpopular fashion statement that came with very serious, fiery consequences. And trust me, nobody was throwing you a celebratory parade for that. More like a pitchfork procession, complete with muttered incantations. Here's a solid fact, pulled straight from the dusty, often dramatic chronicles. Medieval Europe, especially from the 12th to 15th centuries, was obsessed with physical appearance as a moral barometer. It wasn't enough to be virtuous. You had to look virtuous, and preferably not too much so. Chroniclers from the time, like the ever-gossipy Geoffrey of Monmouth, describe queens and noblewomen whose beauty was extolled as proof of their inherent goodness and virtue, but only if they meticulously adhered to societal norms and never, ever stepped out of line. Step out of line, even slightly, and that same praised face instantly became undeniable evidence of your sinful nature, your inherent wickedness. It was a classic damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario, except the damned part was literal, involved accusations of heresy, and occasionally eternal damnation. Good times, now for the truly quirky bit, the kind of historical detail that makes you glad you live in the age of Netflix and indoor plumbing. Some monks, bless their celibate, overthinking hearts, genuinely believed that red hair or freckles were marks of a mischievous spirit, perhaps even a direct curse. Imagine you've got a few innocent freckles dusting your nose, a charming, sun-kissed effect. Congrats, you're now the village's prime suspect for everything from souring the milk, again, causing the chickens to stop laying, making the pigs escape, a recurring problem apparently, and probably even making the Lord's best hunting dog bark incessantly at shadows. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were truly widespread, or just the ramblings of a few grumpy, possibly sun-deprived clerics with too much time on their hands and not enough mead, but either way, your looks are already making waves. You're not just catching eyes, you're catching trouble, like a magnet for medieval misfortune. Beyond the superstitious mutterings, envy was the real beast here, a silent, festering plague that could make the actual plague look like a minor inconvenience. Say you're a merchant's daughter, your skin clear and your smile bright, probably because you actually get to eat occasionally, and aren't covered in soot. The local lord's wife, a woman whose beauty peaked around the time she was 5 and has been on a downhill slide ever since, thanks childbirth and lack of dermatology, notices. Suddenly, her own plain features, possibly marred by smallpox scars, a perpetual frown and a general air of discontent, feel like a searing personal insult. She's not baking you bread or offering pleasantries. She's whispering venomously to her maids about how you're unnaturally lovely, probably up to no good and definitely in league with whatever dark forces make butter go rancid and hens refuse to lay. And don't even think about catching the Lord's eye. His attention, while potentially offering a temporary and superficial upgrade in your living conditions, could just as easily mean a quick, one-way trip to a convent, the medieval equivalent of being sent to your room but for life, with a side of forced celibacy, or a very uncomfortable dungeon, depending on his mood, his sobriety level, and how much ale he's consumed. It's like medieval Mean Girls, but with far higher stakes, infinitely worse hygiene, and the constant, very real threat of actual bodily harm or lifelong confinement. Regina George had nothing on Lady Beatrice, who could literally ruin your life with a single whispered accusation. You'd think these folks would be too busy dodging the plague, surviving famine, trying to figure out why their teeth kept falling out, or simply attempting to not die before age 30 to care about your cheekbones, but nope, they've got their priorities straight. The problem wasn't just idle gossip. Beauty could fundamentally shift power dynamics, and in a world where power was everything and everyone was clinging to their tiny scrap of it, that was incredibly dangerous. A stunning noblewoman could sway alliances or start feuds just by existing, like a human butterfly effect but with more swords and significantly less scientific understanding. Think of Eleanor of Aquitaine. Her beauty was legendary, yes, but it also made her a prime target for rivals who saw her as a walking, breathing threat to their carefully constructed, male-dominated world. You, with your own radiant vibe, are walking a similar tightrope, only without the crown or the massive army. Every compliment feels like a trap, every lingering stare a cold, calculating assessment. Even the village baker, a man whose sole joy in life is probably kneading dough with hands like actual meaty ham hocks, might spitefully overcharge you for a loaf of bread just because your face makes him feel profoundly inadequate. "That'll be 2 shillings, miss," he grumbles, wiping flour on his apron with a glare, "for your enchanting features and the immediate existential dread they induce." It's utterly exhausting, and you're only 1 day into this medieval glow-up. You just wanted a simple baguette, not an immediate, deeply personal existential crisis about your inherent appearance. Let's pause for a second. You're probably thinking, okay, but couldn't I just keep my head down? Wear a sack, cultivate a perpetual, unapproachable frown? Sure, you could try, and many probably did, but in a tiny village or a crowded castle, anonymity isn't really a thing. Everyone knows everyone's business, usually before they do themselves, and your face is basically public property, subject to constant scrutiny. Plus, medieval folks were absolute pros at reading signs into everything, especially anything that deviated from the mundane. A clear complexion? Perhaps you're blessed. Too clear? Okay, now you're suspiciously blessed, possibly in a deal with dark forces. A slightly rosy blush? Clearly, you've been doing something illicit, or you're using unnatural concoctions. It's like they invented cancel culture before Twitter, except instead of hashtags, they use pitchforks and occasionally engage in public shaming that could escalate to something far more permanent. You'd probably trade that flawless, troublesome skin for a good cloak, one that literally absorbs all light and renders you entirely invisible. But alas, cloaks don't come with a stop-staring guarantee. They just make you look like a mysterious, potentially suspicious, perhaps even witchy blob. By now, you're starting to feel the heavy, oppressive weight of those stares. You're not just a person, you're a symbol, a puzzle everyone's trying to solve, and they're pretty sure the answer involves something sinister. Are you a saint, a sinner, or just really good at washing your face with lye soap and rainwater, unlike everyone else? Spoiler, they're not going to give you the benefit of the doubt. In fact, they're probably already debating which specific category of dangerously beautiful you fall into, and planning your appropriate medieval consequence. And as you trudge back to your thatched roof home, dodging a stray aggressive goat, a puddle of unidentifiable liquid, best not to ask, and a kid throwing mud, because medieval children loved mud almost as much as they loved scurrying around like tiny, dirty, disease-ridden rats, you can't help but wonder, how did something as simple as a pretty face become a daily survival challenge? Stick around, because this is just the beginning of your medieval beauty saga. You might want to grab some more mead. You're back in the medieval grind, your too pretty face still turning heads and raising eyebrows, a beacon of accidental provocation. Remember that village baker from last time, the one with hands like actual ham hocks? He's still overcharging you for bread, muttering under his breath about how your looks are trouble waiting to happen. Probably for his business, as well as your immortal soul. Today you're trudging through the muddy, manure-laced streets, cloak pulled impossibly tight around you in a futile attempt at camouflage, trying to dodge the stares and the occasional flying chicken. But in this world, beauty isn't just a personal problem. It's a public verdict, a society-wide judgment rendered the moment you step outside. Society's got a rulebook for what perfect looks like, a rigid, unforgiving document, and you're about to find out how spectacularly you're failing its unwritten pages. It's like a medieval fashion magazine, but instead of tips on how to achieve a smoky eye, it's just a list of ways your face could get you burned at the stake. Picture this. You're at the market, trying desperately to barter for some turnips. Again, because vegetables are life, even if they're bland and smell faintly of damp earth. When a gaggle of women nearby starts whispering, their heads pressed together like a coven of judgmental pigeons. They're sizing you up, noting your smooth, unblemished skin, a miracle in itself considering the pervasive dirt, your bright, clear eyes, and your hair that somehow manages to stay glossy despite the utter lack of modern shampoo, conditioner, or even basic hygiene products, and the constant presence of open cooking fires. In medieval times, perfect beauty wasn't about Instagram filters or flattering angles. It was a strict, almost clinical checklist. Fair skin, because it unequivocally proved you weren't toiling in the sun-baked fields like a peasant, which was a huge, undeniable status symbol, despite the uncomfortable fact that peasants were the ones actually making society function and feeding everyone. Symmetrical features, because balance was seen as God's divine handiwork, and any noticeable asymmetry probably meant you were secretly a goblin, or worse, had dealings with the Fae. And don't forget long, flowing hair, preferably blonde or a light auburn, since it screamed angelic and innocent to these folks. You, unfortunately for your peace of mind and personal safety, check most of these boxes, which, alas, makes you a walking, breathing, highly visible target. It's like acing a test everyone else failed, except the prize for your academic excellence is suspicion instead of a gold star. And possibly a forced marriage to a very old, very unpleasant baron. Here's a straight-up historical fact. Medieval beauty standards were heavily influenced by prevailing medical texts, like those of Hildegard of Bingen, a fascinating polymath who linked physical appearance to humoral balance. Think blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, the four fundamental bodily fluids that, according to medieval medicine, dictated everything from your personality to your physical health. And, yes, how good you looked. A radiant face meant your humours were in perfect harmony, a clear sign of robust health and unblemished virtue. But stray too far from the average, even in a positive direction, and people got twitchy. If you were too healthy, you might be suspiciously healthy, perhaps drawing vitality from less holy, more demonic sources. If you were too radiant, you might be unnaturally radiant, which was practically a flashing neon sign that said, "Potential devil worshipper here." It was a no-win scenario, a trap designed by a society deeply afraid of anything it couldn't easily explain. Now, for the truly quirky and frankly terrifying tidbit. Some believed that overly perfect features could be a trick of nature, a cunning deception, or even the result of a changeling, a fairy child swapped with a human baby. Got a flawless smile, one that seems almost too bright for this dreary world. Maybe you're not human at all. Perhaps you're a mischievous sprite in disguise, just waiting to lure unsuspecting villagers into a bog, steal their livestock, or simply make their lives generally inconvenient. Historians still argue whether these whimsical yet menacing fairy tales were just bedtime stories for unruly children, or a subtle way to justify deep-seated distrust of anyone too striking, too unusual, too different. But either way, your glow is starting to feel less like a gentle luminescence and more like a spotlight you can't escape, casting you in a harshly judgmental glare. It's not a glow-up, it's a giant, flashing, look at me and judge me for my uncanny physical perfection sign above your head. You're trying desperately to blend in, perhaps by staring intently at a pile of suspiciously lumpy gourds, or by feigning an intense interest in a particularly pungent cheese. But the market's a minefield of judgment and potential accusations. A merchant's wife, a woman whose face is perpetually set in a grimace that suggests she just bit into a particularly sour, unripe lemon, glares as her husband, a man clearly enchanted by your unfortunate attractiveness, offers you an extra apple for free. You politely decline, because you know that free apple comes with a bushel of unflattering rumours, all of them highly detrimental to your reputation, and possibly your lifespan. Medieval society didn't just judge beauty, it policed it with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove. Women especially were expected to be modest, demure, and above all, not draw undue attention with their looks. If you're too pretty, you're practically shouting, "Notice me!" and then condemn me for it. And that, my friend, is an incredibly dangerous game. Men could be just as trapped. A handsome knight might charm the court, but if he's too dashing, too popular, he's instantly perceived as a threat to the lord's ego, his wife, and potentially his daughters. You'd think these people would have bigger, more pressing problems, like inventing toothpaste, figuring out how to prevent widespread famine, or simply attempting to not die before age 30 from a minor infection. But no, they're too busy writing elaborate, highly critical poems about your cheekbones, while simultaneously accusing you of witchcraft. Priorities, indeed. The rules weren't just social customs, they were often baked into law and civic policy. Sumptuary laws, for instance, were incredibly strict, dictating who could wear what based on social status. A merchant's daughter like you, absolutely no silk, no bright dyes, no lavish embroidery, no matter how much your father's wealth might technically allow it. You're strictly confined to drab wool and humble linen, lest you accidentally look like someone of higher standing and challenge the rigid social hierarchy. Break those rules, and you're not just vain, you're challenging the social order itself, which could lead to anything from a hefty fine to public humiliation, or even more severe legal repercussions. Imagine you slip on a crimson shawl because it perfectly matches your captivating eyes. A fleeting moment of pure, unadulterated aesthetic joy in an otherwise drab existence. Next thing you know, the local magistrate's fining you, and the priest is delivering a particularly fiery sermon about pride and vanity that feels suspiciously targeted, making everyone in the congregation stare at your, now very exposed, crimson shawl. It's utterly exhausting, like living in a world where your face literally needs a permit to exist, and that permit costs an arm and a leg, and quite possibly your immortal soul. And don't even think about tweaking your look to fit in, or, God forbid, to enhance your natural beauty. Any attempt to enhance your appearance, like pinching your cheeks for a rosy flush or using a bit of a berry stain on your lips, could be immediately seen as deception or, even worse, sorcery. They'd shriek, completely ignoring the fact that everyone in the higher echelons of court used copious amounts of lead-based makeup. You're basically committing fraud, heresy, and possibly aggravated assault just by looking good. Who knew beauty needed a lawyer, a confessor, and possibly a very sturdy, ironclad alibi for every single breath you took? Let's get real for a second. You're not vain, you're not scheming, you're just trying to exist. But in this era, existing with a face like yours is a full-time, high-stress, potentially lethal job. You're constantly dodging the merchant's wife who's now meticulously spreading gossip about how you bewitched her husband, with that sinful smile, probably leaving him muttering your name in his sleep, and not in a good way for you. You're artfully avoiding the local lord's son, whose lingering glance feels less like admiration and more like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon, promising future complications. Even the kids in the market, with their grubby little faces and snotty noses, seem to sense you're different, pointing at you with grubby little fingers, probably echoing the whispered witch they heard from their parents. It's not just about fitting the beauty ideal, it's about not overshooting it. Too perfect and you're unnatural, possibly demonic. Too plain and you're irrelevant, a nobody. There's truly no winning, only surviving, and the prize for surviving is just more surviving. As you head home, clutching your overpriced turnips, you can't help but feel the crushing weight of those unwritten, unspoken, yet utterly pervasive rules. Every step is a reminder. Your beauty isn't yours to enjoy. It's a currency, a weapon, a liability, and a constant source of suspicion. And the worst part, you didn't choose this. You just woke up with this face, and now you're navigating a world that's decided it means something. Usually something profoundly bad. The sun's dipping low, casting long, ominous shadows across the village, and you're already bracing for tomorrow's inevitable judgments. Beauty is supposed to be a gift, a blessing, but here, it's starting to feel like a curse, a relentless, inescapable burden that seems determined to follow you to your grave. You're still weaving through the medieval world, your too pretty face a magnet for whispers and sideways glances, a constant source of theological debate. Remember that merchant's wife from the market, the one who thought your smile bewitched her husband, and that suspiciously observant herbalist. Their whispers are probably echoing through the village now, amplified by bored villagers and idle gossip, twisting your beauty into something sinister, reaching every ear faster than a bad case of the flux or a particularly exciting new rumour about the Lord's latest mistress. Today, you're slipping into a venerable stone church, the air cool and heavy with the scent of old stone, dampness, and stale, cloying incense, hoping for a moment of genuine peace, a fleeting respite from the judging eyes of the secular world. Maybe, just maybe, God's house offers true sanctuary from the relentless scrutiny. But even here, within the sacred walls, your beauty isn't just a physical trait. It's a profound theological puzzle. In this era, a face like yours could be interpreted as a divine gift, a testament to God's ultimate craftsmanship, or, far more terrifyingly, a demonic trap, cunningly set to ensnare the righteous. And everyone, from the lowliest peasant to the most learned cleric, seems to have a strong, unshakable opinion on which category you fall into, and they are absolutely not afraid to share it, loudly and often to your face. Picture yourself kneeling on the worn, uneven flagstones of the church floor, your knees protesting the cold, hard surface. Candlelight flickers across your features, casting dancing shadows that make you look even more ethereal and therefore inherently suspicious. The priest at the altar, a stern-faced man with eyes that seem to see right through your very soul, or at least your clean linen underdress, and any unconfessed sins you might be harbouring, shoots you a prolonged, unsettling glance, his brow furrowing deeper than a freshly ploughed field on a particularly windy day. Medieval folks were utterly obsessed with the idea that looks reflected the soul, that your outward appearance was a direct window into your inner spiritual state. A radiant face could mean God handcrafted you with extra care, like a walking, breathing masterpiece, a true testament to his artistic prowess and benevolence. But if you're too striking, too perfect, that same radiance might hint at darker forces, a more insidious influence. The devil, they fervently believed, was a master of disguise, capable of transforming himself into an angel of light, and a gorgeous face was the perfect costume to lure the faithful astray, to tempt them into sin. You're just trying to pray, perhaps hoping for a silent blessing that doesn't come with an immediate, terrifying interrogation, but your glow is practically a sermon topic, a visual aid for the priest's fire and brimstone lecture. It's like your face is simultaneously auditioning for sainthood and the leading role in a cautionary tale about demonic temptation. And frankly, the villain role has far better lighting and more dramatic flair. Here's a grounded historical fact, drawn from the intricate theological debates of the era. Medieval theologians like Thomas Aquinas wrote extensively about beauty as a reflection of divine order, arguing that physical harmony mirrored God's creation. A perfectly balanced face was proof of a perfectly balanced soul. This was great in theory, for perfectly average-looking people who blended seamlessly into the background. But it became incredibly tricky in practice if you deviated too much from the norm, even in a positive direction. If you were too healthy, too robust, you might be suspiciously healthy, perhaps drawing vitality from less holy, more forbidden sources. If you were too radiant, too captivating, you might be unnaturally radiant, which was practically a flashing neon sign above your head that screamed, "Potential devil worshipper here, please investigate." It was a quintessential no-win scenario, a trap designed by a society deeply afraid of anything it couldn't easily explain within the rigid confines of its religious dogma. Now for the truly quirky and frankly terrifying tidbit that probably kept many medieval villagers awake at night. Some rural communities, particularly those prone to isolation and superstition, took these theological ideas to extreme, literal interpretations. They firmly believed that unusually beautiful people might be glamoured by demons to tempt the righteous, or perhaps even be actual succubi or incubi in human form. Got eyes that sparkle a bit too much? A mischievous glint in your gaze? Congrats, you're now starring in the village's next exorcism, a terrifying spectacle that probably involves a lot of chanting, splashing of holy water, burning of pungent herbs, and possibly even some goat entrails for good measure. Historians still argue whether these whimsical yet menacing fairy tales were just elaborate bedtime stories for unruly children, or a subtle, pervasive way to justify deep-seated distrust of anyone too striking, too unusual, too different, too alluring. But either way, your mere presence in this church is stirring up more than just dust from the ancient wooden pews. It's stirring up fear, suspicion, and a palpable sense of unease. You're trying desperately to keep your head down, praying for an invisibility cloak that actually works, one that renders you utterly undetectable to both human and divine judgment. But the congregation's whispers follow you like a swarm of particularly persistent judgmental flies drawn to a honeypot, or more likely a pile of something far less appealing. An old woman, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, hardship, and suspicion, clutches her wooden rosary so tightly her knuckles are white, eyeing your clear skin as if it's a personal offence, a blatant affront to the harsh, grimy realities of medieval life. A young man in the back stares, then blushes crimson and quickly looks away, probably worried he's already sinned just by gazing upon your face, thus risking eternal damnation. The problem isn't just that you're pretty, it's that your beauty feels like a direct, undeniable challenge to their worldview, a blatant affront to their understanding of the natural order and divine justice. If God's so good, why give a mere merchant's daughter a face that so easily outshines the nobility? If the devil's so sneaky, why not use someone as beautiful as you to sow chaos, tempt the pious, and ruin perfectly good crops? It's utterly exhausting, like being a complex, terrifying riddle that nobody wants to solve, but everyone wants to punish you for being. You'd trade those perfect cheekbones for a plain, forgettable face if it meant you could pray in peace without an audience, or at least without someone audibly muttering about evil enchantments and unnatural allure under their breath. The church, tragically, wasn't just a place of worship. It was also a formidable courtroom for appearances, a moral tribunal that judged your very essence based on your physical form. Clerics often preached that beauty was a test, a severe temptation to vanity or lust. If you're aware of your looks, even subconsciously, you're prideful, a cardinal sin that ranked high on the list. If others notice you, even against your will, you're a stumbling block, tempting them into lustful thoughts or soul-corroding envy. Either way, you're in deep theological trouble. Imagine you make a small, unconscious movement to adjust your headscarf, trying to hide a stray lock of hair that has rebelliously escaped your braid. The priest might interpret that as an act of vanity, a subtle sign you're flaunting God's gifts, trying to draw attention to yourself. But leave your hair loose, and you're openly tempting the menfolk, practically inviting them to gaze upon your sinful, unbound tresses. It's a lose-lose scenario, a spiritual catch-22, like trying to win a chess game where all your pieces are pawns and your opponent is the notoriously humorless Grand Inquisitor. And don't think men were immune to this scrutiny. A charming minstrel with your kind of irresistible looks might be accused of bewitching the village girls with his songs, leading to a rather abrupt and painful career change, possibly involving a very uncomfortable ducking stool. At this rate, you're half expecting a beautifully carved, ominous "No Pretty People" sign to be nailed to the heavy oak church door, perhaps in tasteful Gothic script. Let's be real, you didn't ask for this profound cosmic debate. You just wanted to light a candle for your deceased grandmother, maybe offer a quiet prayer for your family's safety, and perhaps even sneak a quick nap in the pews before lunch. But in this unforgiving world, beauty is never, ever neutral. It's an active, potent signal, a spark that could ignite profound awe or abject terror, fervent piety or superstitious dread. The priest's sermon today is about humility, about the insidious dangers of worldly temptations, and about how earthly beauty is but a fleeting illusion designed by the devil. And you swear with every fibre of your being that he's aiming it directly at you, his voice sharp and condemnatory, when he talks about those who draw eyes from the Lord and vain adornments of the sinful flesh. You sink lower onto the cold stone, wishing you could simply melt into the very fabric of the church floor, becoming one with the damp moss and ancient dust. Even the faded, crumbling saints painted on the walls seem to judge you, their hollow eyes following your every move, their benevolent gazes now seeming filled with accusation. It's like the entire church, from the rafters to the floorboards, is in on the gossip, and you're the unwilling, highly scrutinized main character in a particularly grim, very public morality play you didn't even write. As you slip out into the fading twilight, the village square buzzing with evening chatter, you feel the crushing weight of those sacred suspicions pressing down on you like a physical burden. The air outside, while still thick with wood smoke, animal odours, and questionable effluent, feels like a breath of fresh air compared to the suffocating judgment inside the church. Your beauty isn't just a social problem, it's a profound spiritual one, a terrifying question mark hanging over your very soul. The first stars are beginning to peek out, cold and distant, and you can't help but wonder, is it really your face that's the fundamental issue, or is this world, in its profound ignorance and fear, just too utterly scared of anything that shines, anything that doesn't fit neatly and safely into their dusty, fear-driven worldview? You pull your cloak tighter, bracing for tomorrow's inevitable scrutiny, because in this medieval maze, peace of mind is harder to find than a decent, genuinely clean bath. And you really, really could use a decent bath, preferably one without mare's milk. You're still dodging the relentless medieval spotlight, your too pretty face a constant troublemaker, a beautiful, reluctant lightning rod for misfortune and political machinations. Remember that herbalist from the market, muttering about your unnatural glow, and the priest whose sermon seemed specifically tailored to your facial symmetry. Their whispers are now probably echoing across the entire region, amplified by bored villagers and idle gossip, twisting your inherent beauty into something sinister, reaching every noble ear faster than a bad case of the flux, or a particularly exciting new rumour about the Lord's latest mistress. Today, your luck takes a truly unwelcome turn. You're formally summoned to the Lord's court, a sprawling, echoing stone hall where power and danger don't just dance a delicate waltz, they perform a highly complex, aggressive tango. Your merchant father's legitimate trade dealings have landed you here, an unwitting guest at the feast, but your looks are what make this gilded cage so uniquely treacherous. In the royal court, beauty isn't just noticed. It's a potent currency, a dangerous weapon and an inescapable trap, all rolled into one impossibly attractive package. And you, my friend, are about to become very, very rich in trouble. Picture yourself standing awkwardly in the magnificent and chilly Great Hall. Tapestries of hunting scenes, depicting unfortunate deer, even more unfortunate boars, and the occasional mythical beast that looks rather distressed, loom overhead, doing absolutely nothing to brighten the perpetually dim interior. The air is thick and sharp with the scent of wood smoke, the lingering aroma of stale ale, roasted meats, and the overwhelming, almost palpable perfume of intrigue and ambition. Nobles in impossibly stiff velvet and heavy fur whisper behind gloved hands, their eyes dissecting you with the chilling precision of a surgeon and the undisguised malice of a hungry wolf. The lord himself, a grizzled, imposing man with a hawkish stare, a perpetually unkempt beard, and a general air of impatient boredom, sits slumped on his massive carved throne, looking less like a benevolent ruler and more like a grumpy bear who's just been rudely awakened from a very long hibernation. His courtiers, a terrifying assembly of cunning knights, overtly ambitious ladies, and intensely scheming advisors, circle you like actual wolves, each one with an agenda sharper than a newly forged dagger, and a smile as thin as a pauper's last crust of bread. Your face, impossibly radiant even in the dim, smoky light filtering through the high windows, draws every gaze like moths to a particularly dangerous, very hot flame. You're not here to charm anyone, or even to speak. Your sole purpose is to stand quietly while your father, his brow slick with nervous sweat, negotiates the intricate price of fine wool, exotic spices, and maybe a few barrels of good ale. But your beauty, that inescapable beacon, is screaming louder than any herald, announcing your presence with a metaphorical trumpet blast of "Look at me and be jealous. Also, I'm accidentally problematic." It's like walking into a room full of highly territorial, very hungry cats, with a ball of yarn that's also made of premium catnip. You're not trying to cause chaos, but it's happening anyway, and you are undeniably the absolute focal point. Here's a firm historical fact, backed by countless tales of courtly drama and political intrigue. Medieval courts, like that of Henry II's England or the sprawling, treacherous French court, were absolute hotbeds of political manoeuvring where beauty could either elevate a person to dizzying heights or destroy their standing entirely, often in a single, devastating move. A striking noblewoman, like the legendary Eleanor of Aquitaine, again, could secure crucial favours, cement vital political alliances, or spark a devastating scandal, depending entirely on how she played her cards. And, more importantly, how many powerful rivals she unknowingly accumulated. It was a ruthless game of chess, but with actual human pawns, and the stakes were far higher than a mere checkmate. Now for the truly quirky and somewhat disgusting tidbit that makes you appreciate modern dermatology. Some courtiers, desperate to gain an edge in the brutal game of appearances, resorted to bizarre rituals like bathing in mare's milk to enhance their allure, hoping to achieve a ghostly pallor or a youthful glow that would outshine their rivals. Imagine a Lady Beatrice, not you, thankfully, slathering herself in lukewarm, slightly curdled mare's milk, hoping to achieve a radiant complexion, only to smell faintly of a barnyard at the subsequent banquet. Historians still argue whether beauty's direct influence in courts was overstated by overly romantic chroniclers or genuinely shaped profound power dynamics. But right now, your natural glow is definitely shifting the room's atmosphere, and it feels less like a pleasant, refreshing breeze and more like a storm brewing, one that's about to unleash hail and lightning directly upon your perfectly proportioned nose. You're trying desperately to blend into the shadows, perhaps by artfully positioning yourself behind a particularly stout knight, or a rather voluminous tapestry, depicting an overly enthusiastic dragon. But the court is undeniably a stage, and you are the unwilling star of the day's main drama. A young knight, all polished armour, swagger, and questionable personal hygiene, they rarely bathed, remember, keeps glancing your way, his grin bold enough to start a duel, and his eyes wide with blatant admiration. He probably thinks he's being charming. You know, he's just drawing more unwanted, dangerous attention to your already precarious position. The Lord's daughter, Lady Clarice, a woman whose personality is as flat and uninspiring as her latest embroidery project, notices every single head that turns your way. She bristles visibly, her own carefully powdered face, achieved by painfully plucking her eyebrows and forehead to simulate a higher hairline, a medieval beauty trend that looked less forehead of wisdom and more permanently surprised egg, Simply no match for your natural, effortless shine. She's not just jealous, she's profoundly, dangerously threatened. Your beauty, by simply existing, could easily draw desirable suitors away from her, thereby weakening her already fragile marriage prospects, which are her family's absolute ticket to more land, more wealth, and more political influence. It's not personal, not in the sense of a petty squabble. It is, terrifyingly, deadly serious. You'd honestly rather be haggling over rotten turnips in the freezing mud than dodging these noble women's venomous side eye. And frankly, a fire-breathing dragon at least has better breath, and is usually more direct in its intentions. The men, regrettably, are not helping your situation. The Lord's son, a lanky youth with more confidence than actual charm or intellect, keeps refilling your goblet with suspiciously watered-down wine, grinning like he's just won a major prize at a jousting tournament. His overt attention only makes things infinitely worse, painting an even larger, more visible target on your already vulnerable back. Clarice's envy isn't just about superficial vanity, it's deeply rooted in the harsh realities of power and dynastic control. If her son becomes smitten, even fleetingly with you, a mere merchant's daughter, you instantly become a profound threat to her control over his future marriage, which could be the singular most important strategic alliance for her family's future. You're not even flirting, or trying to flirt, just existing, and trying desperately not to trip over your own feet in your ill-fitting courtly attire, but that's already more than enough to make you a perceived rival. It's like being punished for breathing too loudly, except the penalty could be permanent exile, brutal disfigurement, or even worse. And don't even think you can just leave. The Lord has formally invited your father to stay for crucial trade talks. So you're utterly stuck in this gilded, oppressive snake pit, forced to sip questionable wine and pretend to be utterly fascinated by the tapestry of a very worried-looking unicorn. Let's be honest, you're utterly exhausted. Your feet ache in your sensible but still uncomfortable shoes. Your head throbs from the smoke and tension. You're constantly dodging Clarice's laser beam glares, the sun's clumsy, unwanted advances, and the hushed whispers of the servants as they clear plates. They are absolutely, unequivocally gossiping about you, and probably embellishing every detail. Even the other guests, minor knights and their perpetually disgruntled, equally judged wives, are actively picking sides, sizing you up, and making their own silent judgments. Some might admire you, yes, but far more resent you for simply existing, and by your mere presence making them feel plain or worse for simply existing in the same oppressive room as you. It's a complex, brutal social chessboard, and you're a pawn everyone either wants to capture, exploit, or crush underfoot. You're starting to think invisibility might just be the ultimate courtly virtue, a superpower far more useful than flight or super strength. But alas, cloaks don't cover charisma, especially your accidental, problematic brand of it. As the night drags on, stretching into an interminable eternity, you overhear a knight, clearly quite drunk on too much ale, joking loudly about how your beauty could start a war. He's slurring his words, but he's chillingly not wrong. History, after all, is full of cautionary tales where a fair face sparked devastating chaos. Think Helen of Troy, but with infinitely worse plumbing, a higher chance of dying of dysentery, and a much less glamorous ending. You're no mythical queen, no legendary figure. You're just a merchant's daughter, a person trying to make her way in the world. But the stakes here feel just as high, if not higher, for your own mundane existence. If Clarice's deep-seated envy festers, as it undoubtedly will, she might successfully push the Lord to act decisively against you, perhaps accusing you of something scandalous or even treasonous to justify your banishment, or even worse, a forced betrothal to a hideous, toothless septuagenarian duke from a distant, inhospitable land. Every polite smile you manage to muster, every fleeting glance you return, every polite nod of acknowledgement is a calculated, terrifying risk. You're walking an incredibly thin tightrope, high above a very jagged, unforgiving floor, and the fall could break you, utterly and completely. You finally manage to slip out to the courtyard, the cool night air a blessed, cleansing relief after the hall's stifling, judgmental tension. The stars glitter above, cold and indifferent, but they offer no answers, no comforting guidance, no miraculous escape routes. Your beauty, the very thing that should have been a blessing, a gift, has become an undeniable magnet for envy, suspicion and danger, a force that could cost you everything you hold dear, as you head back to your father's humble lodgings, the feast's hollow laughter fading behind you, like a distant, cruel echo. You brace yourself for the next inevitable move in this dangerous, glittering game. In this medieval court, being too pretty isn't just inconvenient, it's a constant, exhausting battle you fight every single day, with every single breath. And frankly, all you truly want is to go home, eat some less overpriced turnips, and perhaps, just perhaps, finally get a good night's sleep without dreaming of judgmental villagers and furious noblewomen. You're still tangled in the insidious medieval web, your too pretty face stirring trouble wherever you go. A beautiful, reluctant lightning rod for misfortune, gossip, and profound social complications. Remember that courtly hall where Lady Clarice's glare could have curdled milk, and the Lord's son seemed overly interested in your goblet, not for the wine, but for you. Her whispers are probably weaving new, even more intricate traps for you now, spreading like wildfire across the entire region, painting you as some kind of cunning enchantress, a dangerous siren, or a direct threat to established noble lineages and the very fabric of society. As you slip back to your relatively humble village life, attempting to fade into obscurity, you're grappling with one of the most significant, life-altering stakes your beauty can influence: marriage. In this brutal era, a fair face could, with incredible luck, open doors to a wealthy, albeit emotionally distant match, or, far more likely, slam you into a dangerous, suffocating, and terrifying one. You're about to find out exactly how your looks shape your inevitable future, and trust me, it's less about love, compatibility, or personal happiness, and far, far more about survival, with a bitter side order of property acquisition, strategic alliances, and blatant political maneuvering. Picture yourself, sitting by the meagre fire in your family's modest home, the flames crackling merrily in the hearth, a cruel, ironic contrast to the churning dread in your stomach. Your father, a man whose brow is perpetually furrowed with the immense stress of volatile trade routes and oppressive customs duties, pores over a freshly inked parchment, his usual look of financial anxiety now tinged with a new, unsettling mixture of forced triumph and profound apprehension. A local baron's emissary, a squat, imposing man with a scowl permanently etched onto his face and muddy boots that track filth across your cleanish floor, has just departed, leaving behind a formal proposal that is far more command than request. The baron, a notorious widower, which in polite medieval circles was thinly veiled code for left a string of suspiciously deceased wives, with a famously volatile temper and a sprawling, isolated castle that, by all reliable accounts, smells faintly of damp stone, mildew, and existential despair, wants you as his bride. Your beauty, it seems, is the undeniable lure, the dazzling, irresistible bait in a very unsavory trap. Your father's modest trade connections are merely a bonus, a little, insignificant cherry on top of the problematic, potentially lethal sundae. You're barely old enough to weave a proper braid without tangling it, let alone manage a castle, but your face has made you a highly prized, highly desirable trophy in a ruthless game of power, land acquisition, and dynastic survival. Saying no, you quickly realize, isn't really an option. Rejecting a powerful noble, especially one with a notoriously short fuse and a penchant for escalating minor slights into devastating feuds, could tank your family's livelihood, ruin your father's carefully built reputation, or, far worse, invite a misunderstanding that leaves your entire village in ashes and your family destitute. It's like being auctioned off at a very exclusive and terrifyingly real livestock market, except the bids come with swords, land deeds, and the constant suffocating threat of social ruin or even outright violence. Here's a solid historical fact, pulled from the grim realities of medieval life. In medieval Europe, particularly from the 12th to 15th centuries, marriages were almost universally strategic alliances, especially among the elite nobility and wealthy merchant class. Love, if it happened to blossom, was a delightful, often irrelevant bonus. A beautiful bride, much like a prized horse or a fertile plot of land, was seen as a valuable asset. Figures like Anne of Bohemia, whose beauty was widely acclaimed, were used to seal treaties, cement crucial political power, or boost a lord's prestige in the eyes of his peers. But her looks also made her a constant target for unwanted suitors and an undeniable pawn in immensely complex, often dangerous political maneuvers. You weren't a person with agency, you were an asset, a living, breathing, unfortunately very attractive, piece of highly valuable property. Now for the truly quirky and somewhat darkly amusing tidbit that perhaps only medieval people could devise. Some families, desperate to secure a profitable match for their daughters, would meticulously parade them at lavish feasts, dressing them in borrowed, often ill-fitting but undeniably expensive finery, all to overtly flaunt their beauty and hope to snag a rich, powerful husband. Imagine being painstakingly dolled up like a medieval mannequin, your skin painfully whitened with lead-based pastes, a truly toxic beauty regimen, your hair adorned with expensive borrowed jewels, only to attract a creep with a formidable moat, a dubious lineage, and a suspiciously high turnover rate for wives. Historians still argue whether beauty was, on balance, a bigger asset or a profound liability in these ruthless transactional matches, but right now, your very visible glow is steering you straight toward a very risky, very uncomfortable fate, one that feels far less like a fairy tale and far more like a very slow-motion carriage crash into a very deep, very cold ditch. You're sitting rigidly by the hearth, trying to appear outwardly calm and agreeable, but your hands are clenching your skirt so tightly your knuckles are white. Your mother, a woman whose face is a roadmap of hardship, and whose weary eyes have seen far too much of life's grim realities, fusses with your hair, her fingers tracing patterns on your scalp, muttering under her breath about how your looks are both a blessing and a curse, a sentiment you've heard so often it's practically your personal, very depressing anthem. She's not wrong. If you acquiesce and marry the Baron, you might technically gain significant status, perhaps a few velvet gowns, though you'd likely trade them all for a good night's sleep without nightmares. You'd have a roof over your head, and likely more food than a peasant. But he's twice your age, possibly more, with a notoriously short fuse, a reputation for shouting at servants until they weep uncontrollably, and a castle that, as previously noted, smells faintly of damp stone, ancient mildew, and existential dread. Worse, his last wife died under exceptionally murky circumstances. The pervasive gossip in the village whispers she fell from a tower, but the way they say fell makes it sound suspiciously like was vigorously pushed. Your accidental beauty drew his eye, yes, but it also instantly makes you a trophy, a symbol of his power and wealth, not a respected partner. Decline, and you risk his immediate, furious wrath potentially sparking a ruinous feud that leaves your father's modest trade in ruins, or far worse, leaves you and your entire family begging for scraps in the muddy streets, stripped of everything. You'd honestly rather marry the village goat. It's got better manners, fewer grudges, and probably smells significantly better. The crushing pressure to marry well, or simply to marry, wasn't just on you. Men faced it too, albeit in different, usually less physically perilous ways. A handsome yeoman, a skilled craftsman, or even a charming minstrel with your kind of irresistible charisma might catch a noblewoman's eye, but her powerful family would instantly see him as a gold digger, a dangerous social climber, or a profound threat to their carefully arranged alliances, leading to a quick banishment or a suspiciously fatal hunting accident. Beauty, it turns out, made marriage a terrifying, high-stakes gamble for everyone involved, but women almost invariably drew the shortest, most problematic straw, or, in your case, the one leading directly to a very brief, very unhappy life expectancy. You're trying desperately to imagine life with the Baron, picturing his sour breath, his heavy, demanding hand, and the cold, echoing halls you'd be condemned to roam, a lonely, decorative ghost in your own existence. Your father, ever the weary pragmatist, is trying to rationalize it, saying it's a step up, a chance for the family to rise significantly in status and security. But your gut screams to run, to flee into the anonymity of the deep wilderness, even if it means eating roots and berries and battling wolves. It's like being forced to choose between a suffocating cage and a terrifying jagged cliff, and neither feels remotely like love or even basic tolerable contentment. Let's be real, you're trapped. Your face, the very thing that should have been a gift, a blessing, is merely a bargaining chip, a commodity to be traded in the ruthless, dehumanizing marketplace of medieval power. Even if you somehow manage to dodge this particular baron, a near miracle, frankly, another suitor is almost certainly waiting, lurking just beyond the horizon. Maybe a merchant's son who's kind but excruciatingly dull, or a brutish knight who sees you purely as a conquest rather than a person. Every option feels like a terrifying roll of weighted dice, and the odds are unequivocally not in your favour. You overhear your parents whispering late into the night about dowries, about how your exceptional beauty might, just might, offset the meagre coin they can't spare, like you're some kind of living ledger entry, a prized horse at a fair, paraded and inspected for flaws. It's utterly dehumanizing. You're half tempted to deliberately smudge dirt on your face, cut off all your beautiful hair, and generally scare off any potential suitors. But knowing this ridiculously superstitious village, they'd probably immediately call it a new avant-garde beauty trend and start copying you, thus making your sacrifice utterly pointless. As night falls, the fire's embers glow, mirroring the uneasy, flickering dread in your chest. You're not just choosing a husband, you're choosing a life, or perhaps a sentence, and a very, very long one at that. Your beauty, through no fault of your own, has opened doors, yes, but they lead to places you might not survive, physically, emotionally, or spiritually. The Baron's emissary will return tomorrow for a final answer, and the crushing weight of that deadline presses down on you like a cold, immovable stone. You stare into the flames, wishing for a miraculous way out, for a sudden, unexpected plague to strike the Baron. Just the Baron, of course, and very quickly. But in this medieval world, a pretty face doesn't grant freedom. It just changes the shape of your chains, making them prettier perhaps, but no less binding. You pull your shawl tighter, the night's chill creeping in, and brace for the next inevitable twist in this relentless, beautiful, and utterly terrifying saga. You just want a simple life, a little peace, and perhaps, just perhaps, to finally get a good night's sleep without dreaming of judgmental villagers, furious noblewomen, and terrifyingly persistent barons. All right, settle in, folks, because tonight we're diving headfirst into one of history's most spectacularly weird rabbit holes. Forget dragons and magic. We're talking about something far more fantastical and, frankly, a little gross, the world of medieval royalty, and what happens when you keep marrying your cousins for a few too many generations. Spoiler alert, it's not good. You probably won't survive this journey genetically speaking, but it is utterly fascinating. So, before you get too comfortable, maybe take a moment to smash that like button and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. No pressure, no ancient curses if you don't. I'm curious, what city are you listening from tonight, and what time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing how far this delightfully peculiar history community stretches. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft, comforting hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this: the crackling of fire in a vast stone hall, the flicker of candlelight catching on silver goblets, and a young noblewoman in velvet robes being introduced to her future husband, who is also casually her cousin, or her uncle, or her nephew. Welcome to the elite world of medieval European aristocracy, where bloodlines mattered more than biology, and love had absolutely nothing to do with marriage. The term inbred carries a punch today, right? It sounds like something whispered in hushed tones, usually followed by a disgusted shudder. But in the medieval context, it wasn't a slur, it was strategy. Dynasties like the Habsburgs, the Capetians, and the Trastamaras didn't just intermarry for fun. They did it to hoard power, land, and legitimacy. Think about it. If you marry your cousin, you don't lose any castles. You keep the wealth, the influence, and the shiny titles all neatly wrapped up within the family. If you marry a foreigner, suddenly someone else is raising your heir in a rival kingdom, potentially whispering sweet nothings about their own family's claims. So, the logic was crystal clear, even if the genetic consequences weren't. Yet, over generations, that cold, calculated logic led to genetic whirlpools that birthed some of the most fascinating and, frankly, tragic figures in European history. You're going to meet women tonight who were daughters of double first cousins, nieces married to their uncles, and sisters married off to their first cousin once removed. These aren't just mathematical absurdities. They were real women with complicated lives, deep loyalties, and sometimes the shocking symptoms of what happens when your DNA plays the royal version of musical chairs. We'll visit stone palaces in Spain, gloomy castles in Austria, and glittering courts in France and the Low Countries. You'll watch as empires rise and fall around these women, many of whom, let's be honest, never got a say in the matter. Their lives were simply negotiating chips in a high-stakes game of geopolitical poker. Take the Habsburgs, for instance, the undisputed champions of European inbreeding. Their family tree isn't so much a tree as it is a tightly woven wreath, or perhaps a pretzel that got left out in the sun too long and just fused. They built a global empire on a foundation of strategic marriages, each one drawing the family net tighter until it practically strangled itself. And while we'll spend time with some of the more infamous male Habsburgs later, it's the women who carried the generational load, both politically and genetically. These women were the mothers of kings and queens, the breeders of empire, and the unfortunate bearers of some truly unlucky genetic traits. But it wasn't just the Habsburgs. The Capedians of France, the Trastamaras of Spain, and even the Plantagenets of England dipped their royal toes in the same shallow gene pool. The goal was always the same: consolidate claims, prevent messy civil wars, and lock down dynastic legitimacy. But with that came feuds, forced marriages, and a trail of noblewomen who spent their lives navigating a world where family meant everything and meant way too much. What's wild is how obvious some of the side effects became over time. Elongated jaws, the infamous Habsburg jaw, fertility issues, recurring mental illness, stillbirths, and strangely shaped skulls pop up again and again in these royal lineages. Yet nobody seemed all that eager to change course. Even the church, which technically forbade incestuous marriages past a certain degree, made generous exceptions for royals. The Pope would often grant a dispensation, basically a holy permission slip, for yet another cousin marriage, as long as it kept the peace, or, more accurately, kept the donations flowing into the Vatican. Here's the kicker. Modern geneticists have actually studied some of these lineages and confirmed what those medieval matchmakers refused to see. Inbreeding coefficients, yes, that's a thing, are measurable. And several royal offspring had scores comparable to the children of sibling unions, one of the highest ever recorded. Think about that for a second. We're talking about children with the same level of genetic concentration as if their parents were full siblings. Take Charles II of Spain, whose tragic tale we'll save for the end. But spoiler, he couldn't chew food properly, couldn't walk without help, and likely had the mental development of a 5-year-old. And yes, he had a lot of aunts and uncles who were also his cousins. It was less a family tree and more a very tangled shrub. Of course, not every royal woman with a tangled ancestry suffered overtly. Some were brilliant rulers, effective diplomats, and adored queens. One of the fringe debates among historians today is just how much inbreeding actually influenced personality or mental stability. For example, was Joanna the Mad of Castile actually insane, or just caught in a brutal political trap where her erratic behaviour was exaggerated to keep her from ruling? Was her daughter's melancholy a symptom of family genetics, or the result of a lifetime trapped between power and duty? This kind of question pops up a lot when you start pulling threads on these women's lives. How much was nature, and how much was nurture? These women weren't just passive figures. They were queens, regents, and mothers, shaping the future of empires. Some of them ruled directly, others ruled through their sons or husbands, and they all bore the burden of dynastic duty in a way their male counterparts didn't. A prince might go off to war or drink himself to death, but a princess was expected to marry whomever the crown required and produce heirs no matter how many miscarriages, deformities, or depressions came along the way. Their bodies were quite literally the battleground of empire. In the next sections, we'll meet specific women whose stories exemplify this strange intersection of politics, genetics, and deeply personal struggle. You'll follow Isabella of Habsburg as her bloodline loops inward, Joanna of Castile as her sanity is questioned, and Eleanor of Portugal as she marries her own uncle to cement imperial power. Along the way, we'll sprinkle in facts you've never heard before, like which queen's jaw had to be redrawn in official portraits to make it look less prominent, or which princess was technically her husband's great-aunt. Yes, really. So, buckle up gently. The next hour might just make you profoundly grateful for your boring, unroyal DNA. Let's head straight into the tangled tapestry of inbred nobility, with a woman who is practically the poster child for what happens when your entire family tree folds in on itself like an origami disaster. Isabella of Habsburg. If you've ever wondered what it's like to be the result of multiple generations of cousin marriages, well, meet Isabella. She doesn't just belong to the Habsburg dynasty. She is the Habsburg dynasty, rolled up into one velvet-draped, highly ceremonial genetic loop. Born in 1501, Isabella was the daughter of Philip the Handsome. Yes, that was his actual nickname, we'll get to why it's ironic later. And Joanna of Castile, aka Joanna the Mad, who we'll meet properly in the next section. For now, just note that Isabella's parents were both grandchildren of the same royal couple, Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile. That means Isabella's family tree was already bending awkwardly in on itself from the moment she cried her first baby cry in Brussels. And by the time she reached marrying age, around 13, because of course she did, her value wasn't about her smile or her charm. It was all about the blood, that precious, increasingly concentrated Habsburg blood. She was married off to Christian II of Denmark, Norway and Sweden, a man described by contemporaries as morose, which is a polite way of saying he was probably a bit of a nightmare. Their marriage was political, like every marriage of the age, but it also had an edge of desperation. Christian needed allies, and the Habsburgs needed influence in Scandinavia. Isabella was the literal body through which that influence would flow. Her uterus was now official royal policy. Good times. Here's where it gets complicated, because, of course, it does. Christian wasn't exactly stable. He was charming at times, yes, and he clearly liked Isabella, but he also had a favourite mistress, Dyveke Sigbritsdatter, whom he refused to abandon even after marrying the Habsburg princess. Dyveke was low-born, not even nobility, and Isabella had to sit there in her Danish castle, pregnant with the future, while her husband paraded his mistress around court like a new horse. That must have stung, even for someone raised to accept political marriages as part of the royal gig. But Isabella held her own. She bore Christian 6 children, 3 of whom survived infancy, which in itself was a minor miracle given the gene pool and the general medieval lack of sanitation. One of her sons, John, would have a short life, but her daughter Dorothea would go on to marry another cousin naturally. Isabella's influence at court grew, particularly after Dyveke died suddenly. Maybe from poisoned cherries, maybe not. The truth is murky, and so are the rumours. Some whispered that Isabella or her allies had a hand in it, but there's no hard proof, just a sudden vacancy in the royal mistress role, and a queen who stepped up into real power. And yet, the genetic weight of her ancestry didn't disappear. Isabella herself suffered from bouts of illness that some historians now think might have been linked to haemophilia or a similar inherited disorder. She died young, just 24 years old. The official cause, a sudden illness. The medieval catch-all term for anything from tuberculosis to a stroke to, well, inherited genetic dysfunctions we can't quite pin down from the comfort of our modern armchairs. A quirky fact about Isabella's brief life: she was fluent in at least 5 languages thanks to her Habsburg upbringing. These weren't "I can ask where the bathroom is" skills either. She could hold diplomatic conversations in Latin, Castilian, Flemish, French and German. Her letters reveal a sharp mind, a touch of sarcasm, and a keen understanding of the politics around her. She wasn't just a vessel for babies. She was aware of the chessboard and moved across it as much as her gender allowed. Now, here's where scholars still butt heads. Was Isabella a victim of her family's obsession with purity, or simply unlucky in a dangerous age? Some point to her children's weak health, and her own early death as clear signs of genetic fragility. Others argue that early mortality was just part of the course in the 16th century, even for royals. And while that's true to an extent, the Habsburgs' increasingly closed breeding circles make the debate harder to ignore. What's not debated is this: Isabella's children carried forward even more concentrated royal blood, making the next generation of Habsburgs even more genetically enclosed. Her grandson, Maximilian II, would marry his first cousin, and their children, well, let's just say their jawlines could cut glass, and not in a good way. One eerie thing about Isabella's life is how quiet it feels in retrospect. She's one of those queens you rarely hear about unless you go looking. No big wars, no grand scandals, no famous paintings, and yet her DNA echoes all through European history. Her blood ran in the veins of emperors, kings, and doomed heirs. If power in this world can be measured by legacy, then Isabella was more powerful than most of the men around her. She just didn't get a crown to show it. You almost want to go back in time and whisper to her through the veil of centuries, "Hey, maybe skip that cousin. Maybe tell your daughter to try someone new, like someone not related." But you know she couldn't. That was the game, and she played it as well as anyone with her last name could. From the quiet courts of Denmark to the loud echoes of dynastic strategy, Isabella of Habsburg's life is one of the clearest examples of what happens when royalty values family ties just a bit too much. She didn't live long, but what she passed on would shape Europe for the next 2 centuries, and a lot of those results weren't exactly healthy. Now that you've met Isabella of Habsburg, it's time to step even deeper into the foggy Gothic corridors of royal heredity and meet her mother, Joanna of Castile. Or, as she's better known in the history books, Joanna the Mad. You've probably heard the nickname before. Maybe you picture her wandering a castle barefoot, mumbling to herself, or clutching her dead husband's coffin like a morbid romantic. And, yeah, some of that actually happened. But the full story of Joanna, it's less madness and more tragedy, with a generous sprinkle of dynastic pressure, and of course, a heavy dose of concentrated family genetics. Joanna was born in 1479 to Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile, Spain's power couple, the Catholic monarchs who unified the Spanish kingdoms and sponsored a certain Christopher Columbus. Their marriage was the ultimate political power move, and they wanted their children to follow suit. Joanna was their third child, smart, reserved, and devout, with eyes that reportedly smouldered when she was angry. But there was one catch. Her family tree already had that classic royal kink. Her parents were second cousins. Not a terrible start by medieval standards, but the signs of internal looping were starting to flicker. As a young woman, Joanna was shipped off to Flanders to marry Philip the Handsome. Yes, that's literally what they called him. And yes, it was mostly for politics. Philip was the son of Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I and Mary of Burgundy, and this union was meant to forge a powerful European alliance. But unlike many arranged royal marriages, Joanna and Philip were weirdly into each other. Like, passionately, obsessively into each other at first. The kind of chemistry that raised eyebrows at court. You might think, oh, that's sweet. But this is bedtime history, not a fairy tale, so you know what's coming. Philip was charming, ambitious, and very aware of his own good looks. Joanna, deeply in love, became intensely jealous, especially once Philip began openly cheating on her. She would reportedly scream, throw things, and demand to know the names of his mistresses. Court rumour had it that she once attacked a lady-in-waiting with scissors over a flirtatious glance. Was she mentally ill, or just a woman pushed to the edge in a world where her power was always second to her husband's pleasure? Things only got worse when her mother, Queen Isabella, died, and Joanna became Queen of Castile. On paper, this should have made her one of the most powerful women in Europe. But Philip wasn't having it. He tried to muscle in as king, claiming Joanna was too unstable to rule. Her father, Ferdinand, did the same thing. Both men wanted control over Castile, and both used Joanna's supposed madness as an excuse to take it from her. What followed was a slow, relentless campaign to paint her as unfit, a narrative that stuck, partly because it was convenient, and partly because Joanna did start to show signs of emotional collapse. After Philip's sudden death in 1506, He reportedly drank cold water after playing a vigorous game of ball, and it shocked his system, which, yeah, sounds fake. Joanna's grief became extreme. This is where the famous coffin story comes in. She had his body embalmed, refused to bury it for years, and travelled with the casket across Castile, stopping at monasteries and demanding prayers for his soul. Some say she opened the coffin periodically to gaze at him. Others claim she refused to allow any women near it, fearing they might seduce his corpse. Okay, that part does edge into mental illness territory, but hold on. This is where modern historians start side-eyeing the narrative. Yes, Joanna's behaviour was eccentric, even disturbing. But was it madness, or grief weaponised by power-hungry men? She had just lost her husband, was being isolated from her children, and had everyone around her gaslighting her into thinking she was unwell. Even her attendants were under orders to keep her under control. When you're locked away in a cold castle with no friends, no allies, and a lifetime of dynastic expectation weighing on you, madness might just be the only way out. Here's the genetic kicker. Joanna's parents were related, and her husband was her second cousin. Their child, Isabella, from the last section, was part of a lineage that was now officially swirling in on itself. You can track Joanna's bloodline straight down to Charles II of Spain, whose family tree looks less like a tree and more like a family tumbleweed. Also, here's a fringe fact you're not going to hear in most textbooks. Some 16th century doctors actually believed that uterine misalignment caused female madness, as in, they thought her womb had literally travelled to her head. No joke. One account from a Spanish physician describes Joanna as being afflicted with a wandering womb, which they thought caused her hysteria. The solution? Herbal compresses, prayer, and, once, wait for it, a suggested exorcism. Modern scholars love to debate whether Joanna really had what we'd now call bipolar disorder, or schizophrenia, or whether she was simply a victim of socio-political abuse. One particularly interesting theory suggests she may have had a form of post-traumatic stress disorder brought on by constant betrayal and the deaths of her children. Because yes, while she was confined in Tordesillas for nearly 50 years, her children died one by one, usually far from her. She was denied the chance to raise them, see them, or even grieve them properly. And yet, through all this, she remained technically Queen of Castile. Her signature still sealed royal decrees. Her presence still mattered, if only as a figurehead. And the dynasty rolled on, through her blood and her heartbreak. So, what's the takeaway here? Joanna wasn't just the mad one. She was the product of strategic inbreeding, the pawn of rival male egos, and maybe, just maybe, a woman who saw too much and cracked under the pressure. But her legacy didn't crack. Her children would go on to shape Europe, and her story remains one of the most haunting examples of what happens when you mix too much royal blood with too little compassion. Next, we'll meet another woman from a royal bloodline tangled in its own reflection. Blanche of Castile, who finds herself caught in the push-pull of French and Spanish dynasties. But first, let Joanna linger in your mind for a moment. Alone in a fortress, her world shrinking, her love unburied, her name etched into history not for what she did, but for what they said she was. Now your eyes drift toward another castle corridor, lit by a flickering rushlight and echoing with footsteps that trace centuries-old ambitions. Tonight, we cross the Pyrenees into a tale not quite as gothic as Joanna's, but every bit as woven with dynastic pressure and genetic déjà vu. Meet Blanche of Castile. She doesn't get the kind of historical spotlight that queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine or Catherine de' Medici bask in, but don't let that fool you. Blanche was a linchpin in one of Europe's most tangled noble nets, and like many royal women of the time, she was born into a family already looping back in on itself. Blanche came into the world in 1188, the daughter of King Alfonso VIII of Castile and Eleanor of England. Yes, that Eleanor, daughter of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. That made Blanche a granddaughter of two powerful dynasties. Her blood was a potent blend of English Plantagenet ambition and Spanish Trastamara pride. It also meant her family tree had already begun its slow spiral, because the Castilian and French royal lines weren't shy about marrying cousins when it kept power close. At the age of 12, Blanche was sent off to France to marry Louis, the son of King Philip II. But hang on, she wasn't actually the original choice. The French had originally wanted her sister, Ulrica. But when a last-minute switch-up happened, one that scholars still squint at with suspicion, Blanche was plucked instead. Why the change? Some say Ulrica was too Spanish, or that Blanche simply had a better temperament. Others hint at something less flattering. Ulrica may have shown signs of inherited instability, and the French crown didn't want to risk it. Whether that's true or just a smear campaign cloaked in diplomacy, we'll never know for sure. Blanche married Louis VIII of France in 1200 and quickly proved herself far more than a ceremonial wife. When Louis became king, she stepped up, not just in courtly presence but as a political force. And when he died in 1226, leaving their son, Louis IX, later St. Louis. Louis, as a boy king of 12, Blanche didn't blink. She declared herself regent and ran France like a queen who'd been waiting her whole life for the chance. And she had. While other women were sewing tapestries and birthing heirs, Blanche was drafting treaties, intimidating barons, and keeping the fragile Capetian hold on France intact. But here's the part we're here for. Blanche's bloodline. She and Louis VIII were third cousins, close enough that the church had to grant a dispensation for the marriage. It wasn't exactly scandalous by the standards of the day, but it was part of a growing pattern of dynasties interweaving themselves so tightly that marriage options became less about finding a match and more about finding someone you weren't too closely related to. And with Blanche, that issue just kept compounding. She had 13 children, though only a few survived to adulthood. Louis IX, of course, became a king and later a saint, but scholars have often pointed out that several of his siblings had health problems or died young. Common, yes, but statistically higher than normal even for the time. One theory suggests Blanche and Louis's shared Plantagenet ancestry may have carried some form of inherited immune weakness, though this remains speculative. Another quirky rumour, that Blanche was so obsessed with keeping her son pure that she discouraged him from sleeping with his wife. Some even whispered that she had an unnatural attachment to him, though that's probably more medieval gossip than reliable record. Still, it speaks to the way Blanche was viewed. Intense, commanding, and always just a bit unsettling. You don't get to rule as a woman in the 13th century without people throwing a little suspicion your way, especially if you're doing it successfully. And Blanche was successful. She not only held France together during her son's minority, but she later returned to regency when he left for crusade. For years she governed with a stern hand and a sharp eye, navigating rebellions, famine, and papal politics with barely a stumble. But the toll on her family and possibly her children's health remained an undercurrent. One scholarly debate that's still alive today was Blanche herself subtly affected by the genetic tightrope her family walked. While there's no record of physical deformity or obvious illness, some letters suggest she suffered from extreme migraines and recurring melancholia, that lovely medieval catch-all that could mean depression, hormonal imbalance, or something passed along the family line like a well-polished heirloom. There's also a fascinating detail from her death in 1252. Reportedly, she collapsed on the way to a convent and lingered in pain for days, murmuring prayers and hallucinating visions of saints. Some modern readers interpret this as spiritual ecstasy. Others, less romantically, wonder if it was a stroke or a hereditary neurological condition. Again, no definitive answers, just a woman's final days shrouded in mystery, much like her life. Here's a lesser-known fact. Blanche was one of the first French queens to actively sponsor universities. She supported the development of theology studies at the University of Paris and personally funded monastic libraries. So, yeah, while she was wrangling rebellious nobles and managing her emotionally complicated son, she was also quietly helping launch the European intellectual renaissance. No big deal. You can almost imagine her today, ghosting through a candlelit library in Rouen, muttering Latin aphorisms and glaring disapprovingly at anyone making noise. Not mad, not tragic, just tired, and probably still running things from beyond the grave. So, while Blanche of Castile isn't the most inbred woman on our list, she represents an early example of how medieval power marriages began to fold back in on themselves, and how royal women, burdened with bloodlines and expectations carved out their legacies anyway, sometimes with iron fists hidden beneath silken sleeves. Next, we'll travel to Portugal, where Eleanor of Portugal finds herself pulled into a family dynamic so twisted that her groom shares not just her family name, but her uncle's face. Hope you're ready for that one. And now, let's take a soft step into the warm Iberian air of the 15th century, where stone palaces glint beneath the Portuguese sun and royal carriages creak beneath the weight of more than just gold and silk. They carry dynastic expectations, ancient rivalries, and the kind of family ties that require both a wedding and a DNA test. Tonight's central figure, Eleanor of Portugal. If you're already cringing at the thought of an uncle becoming a husband, congratulations, you're awake and paying attention, because yes, that actually happened, and it wasn't even considered all that weird at the time. Eleanor was born in 1434 into the House of Aviz, a branch of the Portuguese royal family known for its tangled roots and political ambitions. She was one of several children born to King Edward of Portugal and Eleanor of Aragon, which already made her a prize in the international marriage market. Her siblings included future kings and queens, but Eleanor's path would take her north, into the chillier reaches of the Holy Roman Empire, where her marriage was supposed to cement a powerful alliance. What no one talked about at the wedding feast was how closely she and her groom were already related. Her husband, Emperor Frederick III, was not only her first cousin, but he was technically her uncle through marriage lines so convoluted they practically form a Celtic knot. But of course, inbreeding among royals wasn't just tolerated, it was the norm. Marrying a close relative wasn't scandalous, it was strategic. If it kept the throne within the family and prevented rival claims, then so be it. The Pope would give a little nod of approval, issue a dispensation, and another cousinly kiss would seal the fate of another generation. Eleanor's wedding to Frederick was awkward from the start. She travelled to Italy for the ceremony, which was delayed several times because Frederick, ever the cautious emperor, was reluctant to commit. He reportedly didn't even meet her until the actual wedding day, and his first reaction was, "She's prettier than her portrait, so yay for low expectations." The wedding finally went through in 1452, and Eleanor became Holy Roman Empress, one of the most powerful titles in Christendom. But power doesn't guarantee happiness. Their marriage was strained. Eleanor, raised in the more relaxed and artistically rich courts of Portugal, found Frederick's court cold, rigid, and depressingly frugal. He was obsessed with bureaucracy and finances. She wanted music, colour, and life. Letters from the time hint at her frustration. She reportedly once said that her husband would rather count coins than kiss his wife. Yikes. Meanwhile, Frederick found Eleanor too emotional, too passionate. How's this for irony? Too foreign. Still, they did their dynastic duty and had 5 children, 3 of whom survived infancy. Among them was Maximilian I, who would go on to become Holy Roman Emperor and marry yet another cousin, solidifying the Habsburg rise to power. But Eleanor, she struggled. Her health began to deteriorate, possibly from the strain of pregnancy's long cold winters, and the slow suffocation of life with a man who treated her more like an economic advisor than a wife. Now, let's talk about the genetics. Eleanor and Frederick's shared bloodline was already layered with intermarriage. Both had ancestors from the Aragonese and Burgundian houses, and their union concentrated that blood further. The result? Their son Maximilian inherited the family jaw, the early hints of the legendary Habsburg jaw that would come to symbolize centuries of royal inbreeding. But that's just the visible sign. What historians whisper about more quietly is the mental health issues, miscarriages, and the faint echo of autoimmune disorders that crop up again and again in the family line. A quirky side note, Eleanor is one of the few medieval empresses whose voice survives in her own hand. Some of her letters to her brother, King Alfonso V of Portugal, still exist. In them, she vents about court life, the isolation she feels, and how much she misses home. There's something hauntingly modern about her complaints. She talks about not having anyone to confide in, about feeling like an outsider even in her own family, and about the cold halls of the imperial court that seem to suck the life out of her. If there's a ghost pacing through those stone corridors at Graz or Wiener Neustadt, it's probably Eleanor, still homesick and misunderstood. Here's where scholarly debate still flickers. Was Eleanor simply a mismatched wife, trapped in a political alliance, or was she experiencing the early toll of genetic accumulation? Her declining health has been attributed to everything from tuberculosis to depression. But some researchers suggest she may have inherited a form of porphyria, a blood disorder linked to noble lineages and sometimes mistaken for madness or hysteria. There's no conclusive evidence, just hints in her letters and descriptions from court chroniclers about her pale skin, sensitivity to light, and frequent fits of melancholy. She died young, just 32 years old. Officially, it was illness, but most agree it was a long and painful slide into frailty, worsened by the years of emotional neglect and probably some good old-fashioned medieval medical malpractice. Frederick didn't even attend her funeral. He stayed behind, reportedly busy with court documents. That tells you everything, doesn't it? And yet, Eleanor's legacy looms large. Her son, Maximilian, would go on to shape European history, expanding the Habsburg Empire and marrying his own relatives with relentless efficiency. Eleanor's blood would flow through the veins of emperors and queens, carrying with it both the strength of her Iberian heritage and the weaknesses of a gene pool that had been stirred far too little. What stands out most about Eleanor is the quiet sadness that threads through her life. She wasn't mad like Joanna. She wasn't iron-willed like Blanche. She was soft-edged, romantic, and ultimately too human for the cold machinery of imperial politics. But she played her part. She gave birth to the next dynasty, and that, for a royal woman of her time, was the highest and most unforgiving form of success. Next, we'll meet Margaret of Austria, Eleanor's granddaughter and one of the sharpest political minds of her day. Raised in a family so genetically compact that holiday dinners probably required a family tree cheat sheet just to figure out who to kiss on the cheek. Now, imagine this. You're a young girl born into a labyrinth of castles, cousins, and kings, and before you've even lost your baby teeth, you're already being discussed like a valuable chess piece. That was Margaret of Austria, and yes, she's technically the granddaughter of Eleanor of Portugal, but by this point, the Habsburg family line has twisted itself into such tight knots that even the family dog might have qualified for a noble title. Margaret grew up in the very eye of this dynastic storm, trained to smile, curtsy, and marry strategically. But what makes her stand out in this parade of inbred nobility is that she didn't just survive the system, she mastered it. Born in 1480 in Brussels, Margaret was the daughter of Maximilian I, the Holy Roman Emperor and son of, you guessed it, Frederick and Eleanor. Her mother, Mary of Burgundy, died young after falling off a horse, which left Margaret motherless by age 2. Right out of the cradle, she was seen not as a grieving child, but as a dynastic prize. Her father immediately betrothed her to the French Dauphin, Charles, who was barely older than her and would later become King Charles VIII. At the ripe old age of 3, Margaret was shipped off to the French court to be raised as the future Queen of France. As far as political gambits go, it was classic Habsburg. Start young, lock in alliances early, and hope no one decides to marry someone else. Which, of course, they did. After years of being raised in France, of learning French, of becoming utterly French in all but name, Charles VIII decided he'd rather marry Anne of Brittany, a much more politically advantageous match. So, at the age of 11, Margaret was unceremoniously sent back to her father. Imagine that rejection. "Thanks for coming, kid, but we found someone better." It was a public humiliation, a slap in the face to the Habsburgs, and a traumatic experience for a child. But Margaret didn't crumble. In fact, this early betrayal seems to have forged an iron will in her. She learned a crucial lesson. In the game of dynastic politics, you are a pawn, but a very intelligent pawn can move diagonally. Her father, Maximilian, then betrothed her to John, Prince of Asturias, the only son of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. Yes, Joanna the Mad's brother. This was another massive alliance designed to unite the Habsburg and Spanish royal houses. Margaret travelled to Spain, a spirited and intelligent young woman, and by all accounts she and John actually fell in love. A genuine spark in a world of arranged convenience. They were married in 1497, and for a brief, glorious moment it seemed like Margaret might actually have a happy life. Then disaster struck. Just 6 months into their marriage, John died. Some historians suggest he worked himself to death, others whisper of tuberculosis, but the fact remains. Margaret was a widow at 17 and pregnant. The fate of Spain, and indeed much of Europe, hung on that pregnancy. If she gave birth to a son, the union would be cemented. If not, well, she miscarried, and just like that, her brief moment of happiness, her dynastic purpose, seemingly vanished. But Margaret wasn't done. Her formidable intelligence and political acumen had been noted. After a period of mourning, her father arranged yet another marriage, this time to Philibert II, Duke of Savoy. This marriage was also, surprisingly, a love match. Margaret found happiness with Philibert, and they shared a passion for art and collecting. For a few years she lived a life that was almost normal, almost content. But then, in 1504, Philibert also died. Margaret was a widow for the second time, still only 24 years old, and once again without children to secure her future. At this point, most women would retire to a convent, or perhaps become a professional mourner. But not Margaret. Her father, recognizing her extraordinary abilities, appointed her governor of the Habsburg Netherlands in 1507. This wasn't just a ceremonial title, it was one of the most powerful administrative positions in Europe. For the next 22 years, Margaret ruled with a firm hand, a sharp mind, and an undeniable diplomatic flair. She became the guardian of her nephew, the future Emperor Charles V, the son of Philip the Handsome and Joanna the Mad. Yes, her sister's child, keeping it all in the family. She managed complex alliances, negotiated treaties, and even sponsored art and culture, turning her court at Mechlin into a vibrant centre of the Renaissance. Now for the genetic bits. Margaret herself, coming from this intensely interwoven family, was a testament to both the potential strengths and weaknesses of inbreeding. She was highly intelligent, resilient, and politically gifted. Yet, her repeated miscarriages and inability to bear living children after her first marriage have been posthumously analysed by medical historians. While difficult to prove definitively, some theories suggest that her fertility issues might have been linked to the increasingly concentrated Habsburg gene pool. Her family had already begun to show signs of genetic vulnerabilities, and while Margaret was robust in spirit, her body perhaps carried some of those hidden burdens. A quirky fact about Margaret: she was known for her sharp wit and even sharper tongue. She once had a pet monkey, who, after a series of increasingly destructive antics, she exiled from her court with a mock solemn decree. She also famously kept a lock of her deceased husband Philibert's hair in a locket, and even took his heart with her in a casket, a rather macabre sign of genuine affection in an age where emotional display was often reserved for public mourning. Scholarly debate surrounding Margaret often centres on her childlessness. Was it fate, bad luck, or a subtle genetic consequence? While many women in the 16th century struggled with fertility, the pattern within the Habsburgs, particularly with later generations, makes the question unavoidable. However, what is beyond debate is her immense skill as a ruler. She was a woman who was rejected as a child bride, widowed twice, and yet rose to become one of the most influential political figures of her age, shaping the future of the vast Habsburg Empire. She brokered peace, managed finances, and nurtured one of the greatest emperors in European history. Margaret of Austria's life is a fascinating contrast. She embodies the ultimate dynastic pawn, moved from court to court, offered as a bride for political gain, but she also represents the sheer force of intellect and will that could emerge even from such restrictive circumstances. She defied the odds, not by having children, but by proving that a woman could govern, negotiate, and thrive in a man's world, even with a family tree that looked like a plate of spaghetti. Her legacy is not just in the bloodline she carried, but in the stable and prosperous territories she governed, and the brilliant nephew she mentored. She didn't have to marry her uncle. She just had to be incredibly smart and resilient. Lucky her. And now for the grand finale. The man who embodies the genetic culmination of centuries of concentrated royal blood. The walking, wheezing, chewing impaired poster child for why you probably shouldn't marry your cousin's cousin's cousin, Charles II of Spain. If the previous stories made you squirm a little, this one might just make you grateful for every perfectly formed tooth in your mouth. Charles II, born in 1661, was the last Habsburg king of Spain. And last is the key word here, because his reign marked the end of an era, largely due to his inability to produce an heir, an inability deeply intertwined with his terrifyingly unique genetic makeup. He wasn't just a little inbred, he was the grand champion of inbreeding. Let's break down his family tree, or rather, his family tangled bush. His parents, Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria, were uncle and niece. Yes, his dad was also his mum's brother-in-law, and his mum was his dad's sister's daughter. Got it? No? Good, because it gets worse. Philip IV and Mariana themselves were both products of extensive Habsburg intermarriage. Charles II's family tree had 8 great-grandparents, but only 4 distinct individuals. 2 of those individuals were themselves first cousins. His inbreeding coefficient, remember that term? It was 0.254, higher than that of a child born from a brother-sister union. He was, genetically speaking, more inbred than if his own parents had been siblings. Just let that sink in. The consequences were immediate and heartbreaking. Charles II was famously frail, sickly, and developmentally delayed from birth. He couldn't speak until he was 4, and couldn't walk until he was 8. Contemporaries described him as having a massive, elongated jaw, the famous Habsburg jaw in its full, horrifying glory, a huge tongue that made it difficult to speak and swallow, and a head so large it seemed disproportionate to his tiny, weak body. He drooled constantly, his speech was unintelligible, and he suffered from frequent illnesses, convulsions, and mental sluggishness. Imagine being king of the largest empire on earth, and being unable to properly chew your own dinner. He was nicknamed El Hechizado, the Bewitched One, because many believed his afflictions were the result of black magic. His court was a hotbed of paranoia, exorcisms, and desperate attempts to cure him, rather than acknowledging the painfully obvious genetic reality staring them in the face, or rather, out of his very peculiar face. His life was a tragic parade of medical misfortunes and dynastic pressures. He was married twice, first to Marie-Louise of Orleans, then to Maria Anna of Neuburg, both attempts to produce an heir. Neither marriage produced children. It wasn't just his physical frailty. Studies suggest he likely had Kallmann syndrome, a genetic disorder that causes infertility and a lack of puberty, among other issues. Essentially, his DNA was so scrambled that his body just didn't quite work. The pressure on Charles to produce an heir was immense, a crushing weight on a man barely able to function. His entire reign was consumed by the Spanish succession, the question of who would inherit his vast empire when he finally, inevitably, died childless. He literally held a séance to try and speak to his deceased ancestors and ask them who should succeed him. That's a new level of checking with the family about your will. A particularly grim, quirky fact. Charles II's embalmed body was reportedly so malformed that it barely fit into its coffin. And even after death, the Habsburg jaw seemed to persist. A doctor who examined his remains centuries later described his tongue as so large that it made speaking and chewing exceedingly difficult, confirming the contemporary accounts of his struggles. Scholarly consensus on Charles II is remarkably unified. His extreme physical and mental disabilities were a direct result of centuries of relentless inbreeding within the Habsburg dynasty. He represents the genetic endgame of a strategy that prioritized power and legitimacy over biological health. He was the literal embodiment of a family tree that had folded in on itself one too many times, leaving him with a genetic lottery ticket that had all the wrong numbers. When Charles II finally died in 1700, at the age of 38, his death sparked the War of the Spanish Succession, a massive European conflict that reshaped the continent. His inability to produce an heir, a direct consequence of his genetic heritage, plunged Europe into a devastating war. It's a stark, brutal reminder that even in an age of kings and empires, biology eventually wins. You can marry all the cousins you want, but eventually the bill comes due. Charles II's life wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a dynastic catastrophe. He was the living, breathing, drooling proof that the Habsburg strategy, for all its initial success, contained the seeds of its own destruction. He wasn't bewitched, he was simply brutally inbred, and in his sad, brief existence, he showed the world the ultimate, horrifying cost of keeping it all in the family. So, the next time you're contemplating a family reunion, just remember Charles II. Maybe branch out a little, for the sake of your jawline, if nothing else. And with that, our journey through the tangled, tragic, and often absurd world of royal inbreeding comes to an end. I hope you're feeling suitably grateful for your perfectly normal, gloriously varied DNA. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this genetic deep dive, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And tell me, what other weird historical rabbit holes should we tumble down next? Sleep tight and try not to dream of elongated jaws. Hello, and welcome to a quiet journey back in time. Tonight, we'll open a door to a world once lost, now rediscovered through the art of storytelling. Perhaps you're cozy in bed, or simply letting the day's last hours drift by. Either way, I'm honoured to have you here. If you enjoy resting to soft-spoken tales and thoughtful history, be sure to subscribe. There's so much more to uncover together. Tonight, we're stepping into a world where winter isn't just a season, it's a test of survival. You're about to find out exactly how the Vikings, those wild, wool-wrapped legends of the North, got through the kinds of nights that would make your modern space heater beg for mercy. We're talking bone-splitting cold, snow that doesn't melt for months, and a wind so sharp it could cut your thoughts in half. Honestly, you probably won't survive this, but that's okay. That's what the blanket is for. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? I'm genuinely curious to know what part of the world you're huddled up in. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up in the middle of a frozen Scandinavian winter, somewhere around the year 875. Snow's piled up outside like nature's own fortress wall. It's not just cold, it's, why are my eyelashes frozen together? Cold, the kind of cold that gets into your teeth. You're in Viking territory now, and that means long nights, barely any sun, and a daily battle not to die of exposure. Outside your longhouse, the world is white and still. Ice clings to the edges of everything, and snow drifts rise higher than your waist. The fjords are glazed over, trees groaning under the weight of frozen branches. You can hear wolves distinctly, their mournful howls cutting through the still air, like the wind itself is hungry, and it kind of is. The world outside is a vast, unforgiving expanse of frozen desolation, a landscape designed to extinguish all warmth and life. But inside, there's life. Thick smoke curls lazily toward the rafters, seeping through tiny slits in the ceiling, a testament to the constant, essential fire. The air is heavy with the mingled smells of wood smoke and boiling meat, of unwashed bodies, and the lingering aroma of damp earth. You're in a shared bed platform, feet tucked beneath your neighbour's armpit, definitely not optional in these conditions, and there are at least a dozen of you, maybe more, huddled under one massive coarse wool blanket. You try not to breathe too deeply. Let's just say the concept of deodorant hasn't been invented yet, and personal space is a luxury reserved for the dead. And still, it's warm. Warmer than you'd ever expect given the biting cold outside. That warmth isn't an accident. The Viking people, often dismissed as mere raiders, possessed an astonishing knack for reading the land, for building lives and thriving where it seemed no one should. You're in a longhouse now, one of the primary structures of a Viking farmstead. These houses aren't pretty by modern standards, no ornate carvings on the exterior, no grand windows, but they are absolute marvels of practical engineering. Long and narrow, with incredibly thick turf walls and low slanted timber roofs that appear almost to merge with the earth itself, like hobbit holes stretched into rectangles. The outer walls are not just stone or wood, they're packed with a meticulous mix of mud, manure, straw, and an almost mystical understanding of insulation. It's a biocomposite barrier designed to relentlessly hold back the encroaching cold. What truly keeps the biting cold out is a combination of ingenious design and brutal necessity. First, and perhaps most unconventionally, are the animals, Cows, pigs, goats, even chickens. They don't just feed you, they live with you, or at least in an adjoining section of the longhouse, separated by a thin partition or even just a low wall. Their collective body heat rises, permeates the thin inner walls, and contributes significantly to the warmth of the human living space. It's a deeply uncomfortable, deeply intimate, yet profoundly effective kind of mutual benefit. If you've ever tried to fall asleep to the rhythmic chewing or heavy breathing of a bovine in the next room, congratulations, you'd make a decent Viking. It's a living, breathing heat source, fueled by hay and the animal's own internal furnaces. And at the absolute heart of it all, literally at the geographical and spiritual centre of the longhouse, is the hearth. This isn't your flickering little campfire, it's your unwavering lifeline. The fire itself is kept relatively small by modern standards, a necessity dictated by the primitive smoke management. Chimneys, as we know them, don't exist yet, but it burns low and steady, almost constantly throughout the long night and the endless winter season. If this fire goes out, someone could easily freeze to death in their sleep. If it smokes too much, you'll be coughing soot and gasping for breath by morning. One fascinating historical fact that often surprises people: these homes were frequently designed with no true windows at all, or perhaps just one tiny unglazed opening. Instead, the primary light source and ventilation came from a single, central smoke hole in the roof, often covered with a simple shutter or animal bladder. It's less about panoramic views and more about the grim practicality of not dying from exposure or smoke inhalation. Now, for a truly quirky and somewhat unsettling twist. As you lie there, surrounded by carved wooden posts, you learn that some of these aren't just decorative architectural supports. They might be your ancestors, literally. Vikings held a belief that spirits could live on through certain sacred objects, and it was not uncommon for them to build their homes around posts that contained revered relics, or even bits of bone from deceased family members. So, when you lean back against that sturdy wooden pillar for warmth, there's a non-zero chance it's infused with the essence, or even the physical remains, of Uncle Bjorn or Aunt Freya. Cozy indeed. However, there's a real and ongoing debate among scholars about just how universally common these warm, tightly knit, family-centred houses were. Some historians believe that Viking society was considerably more stratified than our romanticised notions suggest, meaning not every family or individual had the luxury of a spacious, well-built longhouse with a healthy stock of heat-generating animals. If you were lower class, a thrall, Viking slave, or simply unlucky in your circumstances, your winter home might have been closer to a glorified, thinly insulated shed, sparse, perhaps with fewer people to huddle with for shared warmth, and certainly less meat to fuel your internal furnace. For these less fortunate souls, winter was an even more brutal ordeal, with more snow blowing in through the cracks and the constant threat of frostbite. Still, the underlying principles of clever resource utilization, tightly packed living spaces, and raw human resourcefulness allowed even the less privileged to persist. The Vikings didn't just survive winters, they lived in them. They celebrated birthdays, told jokes by the fire, crafted intricate goods, and, yes, made babies. Which, perhaps unsurprisingly, tended to happen more frequently when you had 16 hours of darkness and nothing else to do but lie in bed next to your entire extended family. Romantic by necessity, huh? But you're not fully acclimatized yet. You're still cold. Your breath still fogs in front of you, a fleeting ghost that refuses to be absorbed by the chill air. Somewhere, a child cries softly in their sleep, probably dreaming of a summer that won't come for another 4 agonizing months. The fire crackles, a small, defiant voice against the vast silence of the night. You try to shift positions, but your legs are tangled inextricably with someone's grandmother. Too bad. You shut your eyes, tuck your nose into a scratchy bit of wool that smells vaguely of damp dog, and wait for morning, or at least for the profound darkness to get slightly less black. Morning, if you can truly call it that in this perpetually dim world, arrives without the dramatic entry of a sunbeam. There's just a faint, almost imperceptible greyness that creeps in through the gaps around the longhouse door, as if the sky is still deciding whether it wants to bother with the day at all. You're awake not by choice, but because someone, in their urgent need to relieve themselves, has stumbled directly onto your face. It's fine, you're a Viking now. Personal indignities are simply part of the fabric of survival. You roll over, carefully extracting your foot from the tangled limbs of at least 2 strangers, and pull on the first available piece of clothing, which, you notice, smells distinctly like goat, or perhaps is goat. Your leather boots are stiff with frost, your breath still clouds visibly in front of you, a white puff in the frigid air, but you're alive, and in this world that's everything. Not everyone makes it through the night, especially when the temperature dips low enough to freeze boiling water in mid-air, which, yes, you'll get to try later if you're feeling brave, though perhaps not wise. Right now, your continued survival depends on 2 crucial principles: keeping your heat in and keeping the cold out. That's where Viking architecture steps in, working its slow-burning, ingenious magic. The longhouse, you realise, is far more than just a crude shelter. It's a meticulously designed living system, an organic machine built to sustain life against impossible odds. As you sit up, you notice how surprisingly low the ceiling feels, creating a compressed volume of air. You feel how the air is subtly warmer just a few feet off the ground, where human and animal bodies concentrate their precious heat. And you observe how everything, every piece of furniture, every storage area, is deliberately organised around that long central hearth. It's not just for cooking, it truly is the sun you build your entire day around. Even now, an old woman is already crouched over it, stirring a pot of thin porridge that smells faintly of barley, and more strongly, of desperation. There's no sugar, no cinnamon, no exotic spices here. This is the kind of breakfast you eat not for enjoyment, but because it delivers just enough calories to keep your heart beating as you move through the day. As you begin to move around, carefully ducking your head to avoid bumping it on the low-slung beams, blackened with decades, perhaps centuries of smoke, you start to notice the layers of natural insulation. The longhouse walls aren't merely made of wood, they're packed astonishingly thick with compacted turf and moss. Viking builders instinctively understood that insulation didn't need to look beautiful or precisely engineered, it just had to work. That moss you see poking out between the rough-hewn planks, it's not decorative, it's purposeful stuffing, a prehistoric form of cork that expands when damp, effectively blocking drafts and probably housing several very confused but equally determined insects trying to survive the winter alongside you. And then there's the roof, angled low, incredibly heavy, often with a thick layer of sod on top. In winter, this sod roof would be weighed down further with an enormous blanket of snow. You might instinctively think that snow would be a problem, a sign of intensifying cold, but here's the counterintuitive twist. The snow actually helps. It acts like an extra, incredibly effective layer of insulation, trapping the precious heat radiating from within and keeping the interior just a little warmer. It's the same principle as an igloo, only significantly more spacious and, regrettably, way smellier. One profound historical fact that often goes overlooked is how utterly deliberate Viking home design truly was. These were not randomly constructed huts thrown up out of immediate necessity. The strategic positioning of the longhouse, often aligned precisely east to west, was calculated to maximize the meagre bit of direct sunlight they received during the short winter days. The doors were kept exceptionally small and low to minimize the amount of heat lost each time someone entered or exited. Furthermore, there were often subtle interior divisions, low walls or even hanging hides, designed to create warmer, more protected zones for humans, while the animals were kept in adjacent, colder, but still sheltered areas. And let's not skip over the seemingly minor detail of ceiling height. You're beginning to feel it now, how you can't quite stand up straight in many parts of the longhouse without ducking under a beam. This is entirely by design. Heat, as any Viking understood, rises. In these remarkably low-ceilinged rooms, the heat doesn't have far to go. So, instead of floating uselessly upward into a vast, chilly expanse, like in a grand cathedral or a modern open-floor home, the precious warmth stays close to the living space, close enough that you can feel it on your cheeks if you sit up near the fire, close enough that your frost-nipped fingers might start tingling back to life if you wave them gently over the embers. But then there's the unavoidable downside: smoke. You cough involuntarily, a harsh racking sound as the wind outside shifts unexpectedly, causing the smoke from the hearth to back up and billow into the entire room. There is no modern chimney, just that single, often temperamental hole in the roof that sometimes works efficiently and sometimes doesn't. Viking life was a constant, intimate negotiation with the raw elements, and dealing with smoke was one of those daily, unavoidable compromises. You either freeze, or you sometimes choke on smoke, or, with depressing regularity, both. And here's where things get subtly weird. Some scholars argue that these perpetually smoky conditions, while miserable, may have inadvertently helped preserve stored meat and even subtly sanitize the space, acting like a low-tech air purifier powered by slow, persistent lung damage. Others vehemently debate whether the respiratory problems and chronic eye irritation were truly worth it, pointing to archaeological evidence of skeletal remains with clear signs of chronic sinus infections and lung issues, particularly in the elderly. So while the architecture kept you warm, it certainly didn't guarantee you'd live a long life, free of persistent coughs and burning eyes. Still, it unequivocally beats freezing to death. If you happen to be part of a wealthier household, your winter existence might be slightly less brutal. You'd have more than just smoke and packed moss going for you. Perhaps solid wooden planks on the floor instead of just compacted dirt, and animal hides, carefully tanned and softened, covering sections of the interior walls for added warmth and aesthetic appeal. Some of the most prosperous longhouses even boasted more sophisticated stone or brick fire pits, designed to better contain and radiate heat, a true mark of high-end Viking living. You, though, you're working class, dirt floor, perpetually drafty walls, and an assortment of mystery smells that you've long since stopped trying to identify. But don't underestimate the profound power of body heat. Last night wasn't a fluke. Vikings didn't just sleep together for comfort. They did it because human bodies packed tightly together create a kind of shared, self-sustaining heat bubble. It's awkward, sure, and the concept of personal space is utterly alien, but when it's a matter of freezing alone or spooning with 3 generations of your neighbour's family, you make peace with it remarkably fast. Survival overrides all social graces. You push yourself to move, shifting closer to the hearth now, rubbing your hands together vigorously, eyes watering from the acrid smoke. An old man to your left is meticulously sharpening a knife, the rhythmic rasp of stone on metal a comforting sound. A child on your right is poking the fire with a stick she's not supposed to have, her face illuminated by the flickering orange glow. You notice a row of stiff leather boots lined up near the door, carefully stuffed with straw, dried moss, or even bits of rabbit fur, basically anything that keeps the brutal frost from biting straight through to the bones. These people, you realize, have learned not just how to endure winter, but how to truly live with it, to navigate its every challenge inch by frozen inch. Quirky fact: some longhouses had ingeniously built-in benches along the walls that served multiple purposes, doubling as beds at night, storage during the day, and seating for communal activities. You're sitting on one now, your backside slowly warming from a cushion that smells vaguely of sheep. Beneath you, likely some dried fish, a tangle of spare rope, and probably someone's perpetually damp winter socks. The Viking version of underbed storage, a treasure trove of practicality. You glance toward the heavy longhouse door. It's still shut tight, a thick slab of wood bolted from the inside, barricaded against the world. Going outside means battling the relentless wind, the suffocating snow, and the ever-present risk of slipping on treacherous ice and breaking something important, a limb, a neck. It also means letting in a blast of air so cold it feels like a physical punishment from Odin himself. So for now, you stay where you are, nestled in the communal warmth. Outside, the cold rages on, a palpable, malevolent force. Inside, the heat holds, but barely. You shift closer to the life-giving fire, wrap a woolen cloak tighter around your shoulders, and listen to the familiar sounds of your temporary home. Someone's humming a low, ancient tune. The pot bubbles gently, a promise of future sustenance. Snow hisses where it melts along the roofline, a soft counterpoint to the wind's roar. You're not exactly comfortable by any stretch of the imagination, but you are surviving. And in Viking country, with the world locked in winter's grip, that counts as an undeniable win. You're starting to realise something profoundly important. If you want to make it through this Viking winter, you can't just sit by the fire all day like a baked potato in a wool wrap. You've got to move, to work, to hunt, to fix things, and to look convincingly alive even when every muscle in your body screams in protest and begs to crawl back under that communal fur heap. And if you're going to do all that without your fingers turning black and falling off, without succumbing to the relentless assault of the cold, you're going to need the right clothes. This means layers, not just a few, but many, expertly deployed. Viking winter fashion isn't about looking good, it's about the grim, unwavering determination not to die. First comes your undertunic, a long, simple shirt made of coarse linen or, more likely, itchy, undyed wool. It's scratchy against your skin, often slightly damp from sweat, but it's strangely comforting in its familiarity. This is your second skin, the crucial base layer. Over that goes your wool-over tunic, thick and roughly stitched by hand, perhaps from homespun fabric. There's no fast fashion here, no disposable garments, only slow, stubborn, painstaking survival. Your legs are encased in woolen trousers, often cut loose for mobility, and possibly lined with precious fur if you're lucky enough to be part of a wealthy or well-connected household. Your feet are shoved into sturdy leather boots, often knee-high for protection against the snow, and critically stuffed with hay, dried moss, or even bits of scavenged rabbit fur. Basically anything that provides insulation and keeps the frost from biting straight through to your bones. You cinch a wide leather belt around your waist, not for style, but for pure utility. It serves to carry your ever-present knife, a small pouch of precious salt, and possibly a bone comb. Yes, a comb. Viking grooming wasn't completely non-existent. They might have smelled perpetually like wet goats and wood smoke, but they still had a fierce aversion to tangled hair, and cared about a certain level of personal neatness. Then there's your cloak. This is the undeniable MVP of Viking outerwear, an essential piece of survival gear. Made of incredibly thick, densely woven wool, often fulled, a process that thickens the fabric. It's fastened securely with a simple pin or an ornate brooch, depending on your status. It drapes over your shoulders like a warm, socially acceptable and utterly indispensable blanket. If you're rich, perhaps it's dyed with vibrant madder root or woad, or even adorned with intricate embroidery. If you're not, it's a sturdy, utilitarian brown mass that smells perpetually like the sheep it came from, mixed with the pervasive scent of smoke. Either way, it holds in precious body heat like a second skin. You might also be equipped with mittens, often thumbless, made of felted wool, allowing for dexterity, or even luxurious fur-lined gloves, if someone in your household possesses exceptional craftsmanship. And yes, they sometimes wore hats, not the horned kind, please let that persistent myth go, but practical rounded wool caps or fur-lined hoods that hug the ears like custom-fitted survival helmets. Here's the truly quirky and somewhat unsettling part. They didn't wash these clothes very often, not because they were entirely ignorant of cleanliness, though, let's be honest, hygiene was a highly relative concept in the medieval era, but because water freezes. An icy laundry day is not just unpleasant, it's dangerous, leading to frostbite and illness. You couldn't exactly boil enough water for a full wash without expending invaluable firewood, so instead of washing, they relied on alternative methods. They aired their clothes out in the frigid wind, smoked them by the hearth. The smoke itself was believed to have purifying properties, and sometimes even rubbed them vigorously with snow to attempt a rudimentary cleaning. If you're thinking that sounds suspiciously like rolling around in frozen filth, you're not entirely wrong. In fact, one perfectly preserved Viking garment discovered in a bog showed heavy staining around the armpits and collar. Clear archaeological evidence that yes, these outfits were worn hard and cleaned rarely. But when you're living in a world where snowdrifts are taller than your child, and the sun makes only a brief reluctant appearance for about 6 hours a day, smelling like a fermented sheep blanket isn't your biggest problem. Staying alive is. Still, there's a fascinating scholarly debate that keeps things interesting. Some researchers argue that Viking clothing was much more colourful and decorative than our modern imaginations often credit. They point to evidence of elaborate textile patterns and the availability of natural dyes derived from berries, roots and lichens that could create vibrant reds, yellows, greens and even purples. So, yes, while you might expect every Viking to look like a background character from a grim Nordic noir series, some, especially those of higher status, may have actually rocked bright tunics and elaborately striped leg wrappings like medieval peacocks. Others push back, arguing that such dyes were rare and labour-intensive to produce, especially in the depths of winter, suggesting that most common folk probably dressed in a more practical earth-tone palette, resembling very stressed, slightly pungent potatoes. Right now, you're wearing whatever you could scavenge from the shared family pile, and you're profoundly grateful for every single inch of warmth it provides. The cloak smells faintly of someone else's sweat and stale smoke. The mittens are two distinct sizes. One boot has a hole in it, crudely plugged with dried moss. You don't care. You're mobile, layered and slightly damp, but crucially, you are not dead, which in this part of the world is about as good as it gets. Stepping outside the longhouse is an assault on your senses, like being punched in the soul by ice. The wind slices sideways, a physical force that drives tiny, sharp shards of snow directly into your exposed cheeks and eyes. You instinctively turn your face down, letting your wool-lined hood catch the worst of it. The ground crunches loudly beneath your boots, a treacherous mix of frozen dirt, compacted snow, and bits of brittle hay that have escaped from the nearby stable. You trudge past the farm animals, cows huffing out plumes of breath like angry steam engines, their nostrils rimmed with ice, goats bleating mournfully as they huddle together for what little communal warmth they can find. If you're lucky, your household boasts a spare building, a small outbuilding or annex where precious clothes are stored, food is carefully dried, and sometimes garments are painstakingly sewn. Inside you see a woman hunched by a tiny, almost symbolic fire, spinning wool with fingers that are visibly stiff with cold. Her spindle turns with a rhythmic, mesmerizing patience. The thread that emerges from it, fine yet strong, will be knit into socks, tunics, cloaks, anything to wrap the body in another desperately needed layer of warmth. Spinning wool isn't glamorous, but without her tireless effort, you understand implicitly you'd be dead by next week. You nod your thanks to her. She barely looks up, her focus absolute. There's simply too much to do, too much at stake. Back inside the longhouse, the shift in temperature is almost painful in reverse. You quickly peel off your outer cloak and vigorously shake off the accumulated snow, watching steam visibly rise from your shoulders and head like you've just escaped the underworld. Your boots are placed carefully by the fire to thaw, or whatever deity blesses the thawing of stiff leather. Someone, noticing your return, tosses you a chunk of dry hard bread to gnaw on, which is about as close to a casual snack as you'll get before the main evening meal. You wrap yourself tightly in a blanket, sink down onto the rough-hewn bench again, and breathe deeply, deeply grateful again to be warmer than the deadly outside. Here's a little historical nugget that underscores the very fabric of Viking existence. Wool was life. The Vikings prized their sheep for far more than just food and occasional sacrifice. Wool was incredibly versatile, remarkably durable, and critically warm even when thoroughly wet, a crucial property in a damp maritime climate. Viking women were universally masters of textile work, dedicating countless hours to spinning and weaving year-round, often producing enough surplus to trade with other households or even distant settlements. Textiles in this economy were a fundamental form of currency. Cloaks, tunics and mittens could be bartered like coins representing tangible wealth and skill. In winter, having extra clothing wasn't just a convenience. It was a form of insurance, a direct measure of one's wealth, and most importantly, a guarantee of survival. You catch your reflection in a dark, polished bit of metal, perhaps a shield boss or a simple buckle. Your hair is matted, your cheeks are windburned and chapped, and your nose is still running from the biting cold. Congratulations, you realize with a grim satisfaction. You look exactly like you're supposed to. You are dressed to survive a world that doesn't care whether you make it through the night. And now you understand something profoundly deep. Warmth isn't just about the immediate heat from a fire. It's about the intricate interplay of fabric, the friction of layered materials, and the sheer physical bulk of 47 layers of scratchy wool that make you look and feel like a very stressed, slightly pungent bear. The cold presses against the thick longhouse walls again, a palpable, malevolent presence, like it's patiently waiting for you to make a fatal mistake. But you won't. You're layered, bundled and slightly damp from exertion, but crucially, you are not dead. And in this unforgiving part of the world, amidst the vast silent snows, that is about as good as it gets. By now, your face has thawed just enough for you to feel the persistent itch where your hood rubbed roughly against your skin, and your stomach is beginning to signal its strong displeasure about this whole barley porridge and air diet you've been forced to adopt. You glance toward the hearth, where someone is scraping the bottom of a pot with a carved wooden spoon, an almost desperate attempt to summon flavour from the ash and burnt remnants. You're not alone in your hunger. Everyone in the longhouse feels it, a gnawing, constant presence. In Viking winter, feeding yourself and your household becomes a full-time, relentless job, and certainly not an easy one. Food in these brutal months isn't about enjoyment or culinary delight. It's purely about fuel. The kind of raw, potent fuel that stokes the dwindling fire inside your body, keeps your core temperature from plummeting, and gives you just enough raw energy to slog through a perpetually snow-covered world. That means fat, lots of it, consumed with a desperate reverence. You've probably never been so profoundly grateful to see congealed bacon grease in your life. In Viking winter, calories are truly gold, and the foods that stick to your ribs, meat, rendered lard, precious butter, dense cheese, are the ones that keep you vertical and mobile when the relentless cold yearns to turn you into a Norse popsicle. Today's meal, you realise, is a stroke of luck. A thick, steaming stew made from salted mutton, rehydrated dried beans, and a few root vegetables that were meticulously buried deep in the earth before the ground froze solid. A precious bit of onion, maybe, if it hasn't moulded completely. Definitely some turnip. And fat, glorious, greasy, life-saving animal fat. Floating on top in shimmering, iridescent blobs that coat your throat like a warm scarf from the inside, leaving a distinct residue on your lips. You tear a hunk of flatbread from a communal loaf, dip it into the stew, and try to pretend not to notice the faint, earthy taste of smoke and dirt that permeates everything. You chew slowly, deliberately. Every single bite matters. Meat doesn't come easy in winter. Hunting in these conditions is a risky, often fruitless business. Most game has either migrated south, gone deep into hiding, or has become lean and desperate, just like the people chasing them, making them too tough and stringy to be worth the effort. That's why the meat you're eating now was almost certainly preserved weeks, if not months ago. Salted, dried, smoked, or even fermented, whatever painstaking process was required to keep it edible and prevent spoilage. There's a hanging rack in the smokier corner of the longhouse where thin, leathery strips of dried fish dangle like prehistoric jerky. They smell, to your modern nose, like pure regret, but to a Viking, they taste like the sweet, metallic tang of survival. And then there's the truly unique, often challenging, fermented stuff. Vikings didn't have refrigerators or modern canning methods, so they got incredibly creative with preservation. That sometimes meant burying fish underground in pits, allowing them to rot just enough to become edible-ish, a delicacy known as lutefisk, or its more potent, pungent brethren. It's the culinary equivalent of a dare, a test of fortitude, and yes, it's very real. Some scholars believe such extreme fermentation methods weren't just desperation meals. For some, they were esteemed delicacies, a twisted badge of honour for those brave enough to stomach them. Others debate whether the average Viking actually consumed this stuff regularly, or if it was reserved for dire emergencies, a last-ditch option when the salted meat and dried fish ran out. And of course, no Viking meal, especially in winter, would be complete without a good swig of mead, or more commonly, ale. Drinking pure water in winter could be dangerous. Rivers and lakes are frozen solid, wells can become sludgy and inaccessible, and snow, well, snow is cold, and who knows what unspeakable things might have been buried in that drift last week. So, they drank fermented beverages, low-alcohol ale, brewed from hardy barley, sometimes flavoured with wild herbs or precious berries, provided both hydration and a few much-needed calories. Mead, if they were feeling particularly fancy or celebrating, was made from fermented honey, a sweeter, more potent brew. These beverages weren't necessarily strong enough to get anyone blackout drunk, but just enough to provide a gentle warmth, a caloric boost, and perhaps just enough mental fog to make you forget that you couldn't quite feel your toes. One fascinating historical fact that might genuinely surprise you. Viking diets, while heavily reliant on meat and fat in winter, were surprisingly balanced for the time. Archaeological digs, analysing preserved food, remains and even human waste, show traces of a diverse range of plant matter. Wild grains, various nuts, legumes, and a surprising variety of root vegetables. They possessed an inherent knowledge of how to grow things, how to store things, and how to effectively dry and preserve harvests. While winter undeniably made all of this harder, they planned ahead meticulously. They utilised root cellars, cool, dark holes dug deep into the earth where potatoes, onions, carrots, and other hardy root vegetables could be stored for months, protected from the frost. Some larger farmsteads even had small purpose-built granaries raised off the ground to protect precious grain from moisture and ever-present rodents. You slowly get up from your seat, licking the last vestiges of stew from your fingers, and step outside again, this time to fetch more firewood for the perpetually hungry hearth. Your thick woolen cloak flaps wildly in the bitter wind like a disappointed ghost. The woodpile is half buried in snow, and your fingers scream in protest, a sharp, aching pain as you grasp a frozen log. But the fire inside the longhouse won't feed itself, and its continuous glow is non-negotiable. You drag back a few pieces, drop them with a thud by the hearth, and reward yourself with another chunk of that hard, chewy bread. A little burnt, and indeed, hard enough to qualify as a self-defense weapon. Quirky fact for you, some desperate Vikings added crushed bones or even tree bark to their bread when flour was critically scarce. Technically edible, mostly regrettable, but it kept their stomachs from growling too loudly when the real food ran low. And the food will run low. That's the most terrifying, unspoken truth about Viking winter. No matter how carefully you store, how meticulously you dry, how ingeniously you preserve or ferment, you are constantly racing the clock. Each meal chips away at the finite stockpile. Each raging blizzard delays a crucial hunting trip. Each broken tool or unexpectedly dead animal tips the delicate balance a little closer to disaster. That's why meals are eaten slowly, with a profound reverence, not just because they're sacred, though sometimes they are, but because each bite counts directly towards your survival tally. There's a particular kind of intimacy to it too. Eating by the flickering firelight, passing bowls back and forth sharing precious scraps, sucking marrow from roasted bones while someone hums an ancient, half-forgotten song. There's no concept of personal plates. It's one large pot, many shared spoons, one loaf of bread, many hands, and always, always someone quietly watching, counting how many rations are left, how many hungry mouths must be fed tomorrow. Even now, back near the hearth, you can hear two elders whispering over a tally stick, their voices low and grave. It's not idle gossip, they're doing math. Simple, brutal, unforgiving math. How many days left before the root cellar is truly empty? How many jars of preserved butter remain? How many people can realistically get sick before things fall apart completely? You take one last, lingering sip of ale, letting its warmth settle deep in your belly and lean back, fed for tonight, full for now, but always acutely aware that winter, in all its relentless fury, is just getting started. Outside, the snow falls silently, blanketing the world in a kind of deadly, beautiful peace. Inside, bellies are full, the fire is steady, and the cold is still knocking politely, patiently at the door. So you wrap yourself tighter, sink a little deeper into your furs, and prepare for tomorrow's inevitable battle with the cold, because no matter how clever the cooking, how meticulously preserved the meat, or how hearty the stew, winter's still winning, and it always wants more. The fire has been burning low for a while now, its embers glowing like watchful, tired eyes, but no one dares let it go out. even if the ambient heat has only managed to raise the temperature a few degrees above freezing in here, that small, constant orange glow is everything. It flickers against the smoke-stained rafters, casting enormous dancing shadows that shift and writhe like ancient spirits moving in slow motion. You sit close, elbows on your knees, feeling the deep, pervasive ache that comes not from working too hard, but from the simple, monumental effort of staying alive. This right here, you realize, is the Viking hearth. Far more than just a fire pit, it is the beating heart, the steady pulse, the sacred core of the longhouse. And sacred is indeed the precise word. You're beginning to understand that in a place where winter can literally break a person in half, where the forces of nature are so overwhelming, fire isn't just a source of warmth. It's a profound ritual, a living myth, the fundamental force through which the world continues to exist. The hearth, you learn, is not something to take lightly. It is watched, respected, managed with a meticulous care that borders on reverence. In some households, you've even seen it spoken to, hushed words of gratitude or supplication. You recall the way the old woman stirs the stew, always clockwise, always mumbling to herself. At first, you thought she was merely eccentric, perhaps losing her faculties. But now, you understand. She's not. She's preserving a tradition, an ancient practice rooted in the belief that fire is a conscious entity, that it listens, that it responds. In Norse mythology, fire isn't merely an element. It's a powerful force with its own unpredictable will. There's Lodi, the fire giant, who once famously battled Loki in a contest of pure consumption and won by not only eating the meat, but the very bones and the plate too. That's not just a story, you realize. It's a stark metaphor for fire's insatiable hunger. It devours everything if you let it, if you are not vigilant. So you respect it, you manage it, and you never, ever let it die. When the snow is still falling silently each morning, blanketing the longhouse in a new layer of white, the hearth must be meticulously revived. This is done with almost surgical precision, using embers carefully banked in ash overnight. You witnessed it earlier, how the firekeeper, with painstaking effort, used a long iron poker to push back the white insulating dust, slowly revealing the soft, glowing orange beneath. Then came the kindling, a tiny bundle of dried moss, a whisper of dry bark, perhaps a few strands of straw. And then, crucially, came the breath, that slow, reverent, gentle blowing, like waking a god from a deep slumber. There's a strange, almost spiritual intimacy to it. You think about all the generations of people who have sat right where you are sitting, their hands outstretched, watching their own fingers slowly come back from the very brink of frostbite. The fire, you understand, gives you back your extremities, your warmth, your life. You owe it a profound debt. Even the very design of the longhouse, you now realize, screams just how central this fire is. Everything within its walls radiates from it. The sleeping areas, the rough-hewn benches, the precious food storage, all are positioned in relation to the hearth. It's the gravitational pull that organizes the entire room, the undeniable focal point. People shift around it all day long, performing their endless tasks, cooking, mending, sewing, carving, repairing tools, and at night the fire transforms. It becomes a flickering nightlight, a tireless guardian. It pushes back the oppressive shadows, not just the physical ones that dance on the walls, but the darker, more unsettling things your ancestors whispered about when they thought the absolute cold of winter was listening. Here's a curious little fringe fact. Some Viking families actually believed in hearth spirits, akin to tiny invisible house guardians that lived directly within the fire and watched over the home. If the fire went out unexpectedly, or if it burned too low without cause, it was seen as a grave bad omen, perhaps even a chilling warning that someone in the family would soon fall ill or die. So, it wasn't just about staying physically warm, it was about staying spiritually safe, about maintaining a balance with unseen forces. If something strange or unexplainable happened in the fire's wavering glow, people paid deep, immediate attention. Now, there's a bit of a scholarly dispute about just how intensely symbolic the hearth actually was in the average Viking's everyday life. Some historians, taking a purely pragmatic view, argue it was just a practical thing. Fire equals warmth, end of story, nothing more. Others lean much more into the poetic and mythological, suggesting the hearth profoundly represented continuity between generations, the delicate line between chaotic wilderness and ordered civilization, even the very boundary between this world and the next. The truth, you suspect, is probably somewhere in between, a complex tapestry of practicality and profound belief. Because when it's 20 below zero outside and the wind sounds like a monstrous beast trying to chew its way through your heavy door, even the most practical, stoic person starts whispering, perhaps unconsciously, to the flames. And let's not forget the crucial logistics. Fire doesn't just spontaneously appear. Someone, every single day, has to gather the fuel. Someone, usually the younger, stronger, healthier members of the household, makes the arduous journey out into the endless snow to collect wood, chop logs, and sometimes even dig out the precious peat or coal from a buried pit if the weather allows. If the snow is too deep, they have to dig down to the firewood pile, which has been painstakingly buried to protect it from moisture. You remember how your fingers felt earlier? That was just the warm-up act. Try splitting a frozen birch log with a hand axe in the middle of a swirling blizzard, your breath crystallizing in the air, and then come talk to us about cold. You shift closer to the hearth now, boots kicked off, your bare toes dangerously close to the ember bed, trying to coax life back into them. Everyone in the longhouse is careful not to block the precious airflow to the fire. You've learned that fire, like people, needs space to breathe. Too much crowding, too many bodies too close, and the smoke backs up into the house, choking everyone. Too little attention, and it dies, plunging the longhouse into deadly cold. It's a living balance, a constant, fragile negotiation, and tonight, as another relentless snowstorm begins to roll in outside, you're feeling just how precarious that balance truly is. One of the older men stands now, his movements slow and deliberate. He picks up a small carved wooden bowl filled with hardened pine resin, and, with a silent gesture, throws a pinch into the heart of the fire. A sharp, sweet, almost cleansing scent cuts through the usual stew meat and smoke perfume of the room. Everyone in the longhouse goes quiet, a collective hush. You don't ask why. No one ever explains these ancient things to outsiders. But you feel it. A moment of shared recognition, of collective reverence, perhaps a silent offering to the hearth spirits, or simply the fleeting joy of cleaner air for a second. But it matters. Sometimes the fire is the only source of light, the only beacon of warmth in a world that feels like it has been utterly swallowed by frost. And for a few long, unending months, it's the closest thing to the sun you'll see. Which is why in some Viking homes fire rituals were intimately tied to the cycle of the sun itself. They celebrated solstices with grand bonfires, massive, roaring beasts of flame meant to defiantly summon back the light. Fire festivals, torchlit processions, flames dancing wildly through the endless night, like a rebellion against the encroaching dark. You rest your chin on your knees and watch the small, defiant sparks drift upward. They hit the smoke-blackened rafters and disappear like tiny stars burning out in miniature. Behind you, someone starts humming a low, wordless song, a melody that probably predates every building in this small, isolated village. You don't recognize the specific tune, but you feel its resonance deep in your chest. Warmth, life, the indomitable spirit of survival. The fire is still burning. You're still here. Not bad for a day's work. Night descends again, swallowing the world in an absolute suffocating darkness, as if the fleeting grey of day had only bothered to peek its head above the horizon for a moment, and then deciding, no thanks, immediately vanished. Outside, the profound dark presses against the thick longhouse walls like a living, malevolent thing, and the cold now has that sharp, dry, almost crystalline quality that makes your nostrils stick together painfully when you try to breathe deeply. You're tucked back inside, spooning tightly, sharing every precious calorie of body heat with every relative, every goat, and every stranger who happens to be stuck in the longhouse with you. And suddenly, the once mundane idea of a hot bath, something you used to take entirely for granted, feels like the absolute height of unattainable, unimaginable luxury. But bathing? That's almost laughable. No one is bathing, not in this season, not in these conditions. In winter, washing yourself becomes an extreme, life-threatening sport. The rivers and lakes are solid masses of frozen ice, impassable and unyielding, and even the wells can be more ice than potable water. You can't exactly boil an entire bucket of precious meltwater and pour it over your head without wasting invaluable firewood, a resource that means the difference between life and death. So Vikings adapted, not out of choice, but out of grim necessity. Bathing went from being a regular, if basic, hygiene routine to something closer to an occasional, miraculous event. Now, here's the kicker, a fact that might genuinely surprise many. The Vikings were, by most accounts, actually cleaner than a lot of their European contemporaries during warmer months. They were famously known to wash on Saturdays, a specific day they called Laugardager, or Bath Day, a fun fact that reveals their relative cleanliness. And archaeological finds support this. They regularly used combs, tweezers, and even small specialized ear spoons, indicating a genuine attention to personal grooming. But once the relentless grip of winter set in, all that went out the very frosty window. Welcome to the season of strategic filth. You wake up, surprisingly, already sweating in your layers of thick wool, which paradoxically seems to make you feel even colder when you finally manage to sit up. Your hair is matted stubbornly to one side of your face, and your wool socks are suspiciously damp despite the fact you haven't moved an inch for the past 6 hours. There's a small communal basin of water near the hearth, half frozen at the edges, and you splash a meagre amount on your face, just enough to sting and shock you into full wakefulness. That, you realise, is your bath. Enjoy it, for it might be weeks before you get another. As for the rest of your body, you learn to cover the accumulating smells with other, stronger smells. Burnt herbs, traces of animal fat, and the pervasive, comforting scent of wood smoke. Honestly, most people around you reek so similarly that your own distinct stench just blends seamlessly into the overall symphony of humanity and livestock. The human nose, you discover, can only complain so much before it simply gives up, adapts, and resets its expectations. And underwear? Technically, yes. They wore inner garments, though certainly not in the delicate, luxurious sense of Victoria's Secret. Viking underclothes were typically made of linen if you were lucky enough to afford it, or more commonly, coarse wool if you were practical. They were often reused for days or weeks on end, patched countless times, and, let's be honest, very rarely washed thoroughly. They were designed purely for utility and warmth, not for freshness or aesthetic appeal. The crucial layering system meant that these inner garments, while still contributing to the overall aroma of the longhouse, were somewhat protected from direct environmental grime and the worst of the outdoor elements. It was a system built entirely on practical compromise, where staying warm, avoiding illness, and ultimately remaining alive utterly trumped any fleeting concern about smelling pleasant. The pervasive lack of consistent bathing and meticulous hygiene had profound, inescapable implications that went far beyond mere personal odour. Skin ailments were a common, nagging reality for virtually everyone, from persistent rashes caused by the constant friction of coarse wool against damp skin to painful infections of minor cuts and abrasions. The body was under constant assault. Without regular washing or access to antiseptic, these small injuries, easily acquired during the demanding daily chores, festered in the damp, smoky, and often unsanitary environment of the longhouse. Lice and other external parasites were an almost inevitable part of life, passed easily and constantly in the communal sleeping arrangements and rarely washed clothing. While delousing combs, often made of bone or wood, were used regularly, they offered only temporary relief from the relentless itching and discomfort. These infestations, while rarely immediately fatal on their own, caused intense irritation, led to secondary bacterial infections from incessant scratching, and were constant, unpleasant reminders of the harsh realities of medieval hygiene. For women, winter brought unique and compounding challenges related to menstruation and, more critically, childbirth. Without access to clean, running water or any form of disposable absorbent materials, Managing personal hygiene during these times was incredibly difficult and often posed serious, life-threatening health risks. Childbirth in such confined, crowded and frequently unsanitary longhouse conditions was a perilous event, fraught with danger and characterized by tragically high mortality rates for both mother and infant due to pervasive infection, blood loss and exposure to the cold. The lack of privacy and sterile conditions made every birth a desperate gamble with fate. The very concept of cleaning the longhouse itself was also radically different from modern notions. Rather than scrubbing or washing floors, they were typically swept roughly and then covered with fresh layers of rushes or straw. This created a perpetually composting thick layer of organic matter, mixed inextricably with spilled food, animal droppings from the adjacent stalls, and human waste from the rudimentary garderobes. While this seemingly crude system offered a degree of insulation from the cold earth and absorbed some moisture, it also served as an ideal, continuous breeding ground for an array of bacteria, fungi, and vermin. The constant dust from decaying organic matter, combined with the ever-present smoke from the hearth, exacerbated chronic respiratory problems for all inhabitants, leading to persistent coughs and lung issues. The air itself was a mixture of life and slow poison. The medieval approach to personal care was thus entirely driven by absolute necessity and the severe constraints of their unforgiving environment and limited technology. They weren't ignorant of cleanliness, but their definition of it was brutally shaped by practical survival. The priority was always, unequivocally, warmth and nourishment over cosmetic purity or even basic comfort. Rubbing down with snow, airing clothes in the biting wind, and relying on the constant heavy smoke of the hearth to, theoretically, kill germs were their best, and often only, defences against the invisible threats of winter filth. This stark reality stands in chilling contrast to the often romanticised image of fierce Viking warriors. While they were undoubtedly formidable, brave and skilled, their daily reality involved a constant, dirty, visceral struggle against the elements and unseen pathogens. The relative cleanliness they might have enjoyed in the brief, fleeting summer months was a true luxury, a short-lived respite before the long, dark and utterly unforgiving descent into the season of strategic grime. You run a hand over your unshaven face, feeling the rough grit of accumulated dirt, the persistent dryness of your skin, and the faint, clammy dampness from your last sweat. Your tongue feels thick and a little fuzzy, coated with the tastes of smoke and unidentifiable fermented things. You look around the longhouse at your temporary community. Everyone else shares the same unwashed sheen, the same wind-chapped cheeks, the same telltale signs of a life lived in incredibly close quarters with incredibly limited resources. It's not pretty, it's not pleasant, but it's universally understood. This shared state of pragmatic uncleanliness is not just tolerated, it's another fundamental bond in the tightly knit fabric of the community. In this brutal world, survival is the only true measure of success, and a little dirt, a little stench, is a small, acceptable price to pay for another precious day of warmth and life. The subtle, pervasive background odour of unwashed humanity, damp fur and wood smoke, is not just a smell, it's the very scent of persistence, of enduring against all odds. As the long, arduous night wears on, punctuated only by the occasional grunt from a restless sleeper, or the soft rustle of straw as someone shifts position, your senses, dulled by the pervasive smoke and the insistent chill, slowly begin to attune to the subtle rhythms of the longhouse. There's the low, almost continuous murmur of the wind outside, a constant, hungry presence that seems to probe every infinitesimal crack and crevice in the thick, defensive walls. Sometimes it rises to a piercing shriek, rattling the single, heavy door, and making the massive timbers of the roof creak and groan in strained protest. You learn instinctively to interpret these sounds. A sustained, guttural howl means a full-blown blizzard is raging, sealing the longhouse in a white, suffocating tomb, cutting off all contact with the outside world. A softer, mournful moan might signal a temporary lull, a brief deceptive promise of slightly milder weather that, you've learned, rarely truly materializes. The sounds from within the longhouse are equally telling, equally vital. There's the quiet shift of animal bodies in their communal stalls, the occasional snort or low sigh from a sleeping cow, the rustle of straw as someone adjusts their position on the communal bed to find a slightly warmer spot. You might hear the distant, regular drip, drip, drip of melting snow from a warm spot on the roof. A small, continuous victory against the unrelenting elements, each drop a tiny measure of heat won. And the most comforting sound of all, the undeniable heartbeat of the longhouse, the gentle, ceaseless crackling and hissing of the hearth fire. It's a primal lullaby in a harsh, unforgiving world, a constant, flickering reminder of the fragile warmth that stands as the last bastion between you and the deadly, all-consuming outside. During these long, sunless hours of profound darkness, without artificial light beyond the faint, dancing glow of the central fire, the Vikings relied heavily on oral tradition for entertainment, for education, and for the crucial cohesion of their community. This was the undisputed time for storytelling, for the recitation of epic sagas about the gods, Odin, Thor, Freya, tales of legendary heroes and their impossible journeys, detailed accounts of powerful ancestors, and sometimes cautionary tales of trolls, Draugr, and other malevolent beings lurking in the frozen wastes. An elder, perhaps the oldest and most revered member of the household, might begin a long, winding tale, their voice a low, mesmerizing drone against the backdrop of the storm. These were not just simple bedtime stories. They were living histories, intricate moral lessons, and vital blueprints for survival and cultural identity. They reinforced communal values, offered a desperately needed glimmer of hope in the face of despair, and provided a powerful mental escape from the claustrophobic, often monotonous reality of the longhouse. Poetry and riddles were also incredibly common and highly valued forms of entertainment and intellectual engagement. Skalds, the Viking poets, were highly respected figures. Their intricate verses, often composed with complex alliteration and kennings, metaphorical circumlocutions, were memorized and recited, often accompanied by the quiet, resonant strumming of a lyre or harp. Riddles, too, provided intellectual stimulation, a way to keep minds sharp and wits honed when physical activity was limited by the weather. These shared cultural moments were absolutely vital for mental well-being, actively combating the creeping melancholia that threatened to engulf isolated individuals in the endless dark. For those whose minds were not captivated by stories, or whose hands preferred tangible work, there were always crafts and repairs. By the dim, flickering light of the fire, hands would be perpetually busy. Women would spin raw wool into thread, weave intricate patterns into cloth, mend worn garments with painstaking care, and prepare food for the next day's meagre meals. Men might sharpen axes and knives, repair broken leather harnesses, carve intricate wooden objects, or mend damaged fishing nets. Every single activity was inherently practical, contributing directly and immediately to the household's survival and resilience. The rhythmic sounds of these tasks, the quiet whirring of a spindle, the gentle scrape of a knife on wood, the rhythmic thump of a loom, created a soothing background hum, a powerful testament to enduring life and purpose. But even these seemingly mundane activities carried their own subtle dangers. Working with sharp tools in the perpetual dimness and poor light could easily lead to accidental cuts and abrasions, which, in an age without antiseptics, could quickly turn into debilitating infections. The constant inhalation of smoke and fine textile fibers exacerbated pre-existing respiratory issues, leading to chronic coughs and lung problems. The sustained, repetitive motions of spinning or weaving, performed for hours on end, could lead to chronic pain, joint problems, and debilitating carpal tunnel-like symptoms. Every action, no matter how insignificant, was a subtle negotiation with the limitations of the environment, the technology, and the endurance of the human body. The communal sleeping arrangement itself, while undeniably vital for collective warmth, was also a constant source of negotiation, minor irritation, and sometimes more significant conflict. The utter lack of personal space meant that every sneeze, every snore, every restless movement, every bodily odour was shared intimately by everyone within the communal fur heap. Arguments over blankets, inadvertent kicks in the middle of the night, and the unavoidable accumulation of odours were daily realities. Yet, the absolute necessity of collective warmth, of huddling together against the deadly cold, overwhelmingly outweighed these discomforts. The very act of sleeping pressed together, tangled limbs and shared breath, profoundly reinforced the community's interdependence. No one, you realized, could truly survive a Viking winter alone. As the pre-dawn greyness finally, reluctantly, begins to show through the small smoke hole in the roof, you hear the first stirrings of the animals in their stalls and the low murmur of voices as people begin to wake. Another night, another relentless battle with the cold has been survived. You slowly stretch, feeling the pervasive stiffness in your limbs, but also, paradoxically, a quiet sense of pride and accomplishment. You are, for now, a Viking. And you have endured. You have faced winter head-on and you still breathe. What aspect of Viking winter survival do you find most difficult to imagine living with?